When priests quarreled over keys to sacred shrines, empires turned those keys into excuses for war. Russia's advance into Ottoman lands drew Britain and France into a conflict that would reshape European alliances. What began as border disputes became a grinding siege on Crimea's rocky shores. At Sevastopol, armies endured brutal winters in frozen trenches, fought through fog at Inkerman, and watched cavalry charge into death at Balaclava. The siege consumed thousands, not through glorious battle, but through disease, cold, and relentless attrition. When Sevastopol finally fell, exhaustion replaced ambition. The war ended, not with triumph, but with treaties forged from collective weariness. Dawn crept across a continent, still shaped by the echoes of old empires. Fields from the Rhine to the Danube lay quiet under the early mist, but the peace that settled over Europe in the decades after Napoleon's fall had grown thin. Courts and capitals watched one another with a caution sharpened by memory. Every diplomat carried stories of a war that once engulfed the world, and none wished to repeat it. Yet behind the formal greetings and polished treaties, ambition seeped back into the great capitals like water through old stone. Far to the north, a sovereign looked southward toward waters that never froze. His empire stretched from forests to steppe, and its size alone made rivals uneasy. To him, this vast dominion carried a duty older than treaties, the mantle of guardianship over millions who prayed in the Eastern tradition. Counselors whispered that history itself pressed him forward, that destiny beckoned beyond narrow straits and aging fortresses. These ideas shaped the mood of his court, a place where ancient conviction mingled with the calculation of ministers who measured every advantage the warm seas could offer. Across the Black Sea, a different world struggled to keep its shape. From the Balkans to Arabia, an old realm attempted to steady its footing in an age that had begun to outpace it. Reformers argued for modern armies, improved roads, and new rights for subjects. Traditionalists urged caution, fearing that each concession opened the way to foreign influence. This tension pulsed through council chambers as news arrived of foreign warships approaching their shores, under the banners of states claiming to defend the faithful. With each passing season, the weight on their fragile order increased. Along the Channel, concerns spread through parliamentary halls and naval yards alike. Merchants and admirals studied maps of Mediterranean routes, worried that new pressures along those waters might one day reach their own lifelines abroad. Ministers debated how far a growing northern empire might go if no one pushed back. Meanwhile, industrial cities hummed with magazine presses and printing works that told readers of ominous moves near distant frontiers. Though these reports often carried uncertainty, their tone stirred a public already wary of any shift that might threaten commercial supremacy. Across the continent, another leader sought renewed glory for his nation. He had risen through turbulence and believed that bold actions could restore a sense of greatness, dimmed since the age of imperial conquest. His advisors understood that influence abroad strengthened authority at home. So every dispute beyond their borders offered a possible stage when clerics in holy places quarreled over ancient privileges. He saw an opportunity. Public opinion, still sensitive to matters of faith and heritage, greeted his resolve with enthusiasm, and his confidence swelled. In the heart of Central Europe, two powerful courts tried to maintain their delicate balance. Their rulers faced an uneasy truth. To act too decisively risked igniting restless populations within their own borders, many of whom shared ties of language and faith with communities under neighboring rule. Silence, however, carried its own dangers, for neutrality in a crisis could leave them friendless should storms gather in the Balkans or the Carpathians. So they hesitated, shaping diplomatic messages that promised sympathy without commitment, vigilance without intervention. What truly unsettled the European capitals, though, lay far from their parliaments and boulevards. In the narrow, sun-drenched streets of a city sacred to millions, old tensions simmered. Processions, rituals, and keys, simple objects in the eyes of outsiders, became symbols of authority watched closely by emperors. Each shrine had guardians. Each lamp and doorway held meaning for communities that traced their traditions back centuries. When disputes flared over access to a revered site, the quarrel leapt from clerical chambers to palace halls. One ruler insisted that guardianship belonged to the followers of the Western Rite. Another claimed divine obligation toward the faithful of the East. The stones of Bethlehem became bargaining chips in a continental struggle. Around the same time, envoys in embroidered uniforms glided through the corridors of a palace on the Bosporus. Their mission was clear: secure written recognition of protective rights over millions of believers. To their hosts, this demand felt less like guardianship and more like the first step toward dominance. Tension rose in the conversations behind gilded doors. When words failed, one envoy prepared to depart, leaving warnings in his wake. Not long after, warships anchored offshore signaled that patience was fading across Europe. Inside the imperial capital, ministers found themselves divided. Some argued that compromise might maintain peace for a while longer. Others insisted that giving way on sacred matters would only invite greater demands. Every debate ended with the same realization: the empire could not remain passive. Soldiers were summoned, horses gathered, and regiments organized, though the full strength of their forces remained uncertain even to their own generals. Each preparation sent ripples beyond their borders, and rivals studied these movements carefully. While this internal struggle unfolded, news spread of northern battalions crossing into principalities along the lower Danube. These provinces, technically under local princes but tied to the old empire on the Bosporus, formed a strategic barrier. Their occupation sent a tremor through the diplomatic world. In coastal taverns and London clubs, conversations turned quickly from curiosity to alarm. Newspapers spoke of ancient rivalries revived and religious duty invoked as justification for expansion. Some articles portrayed the advancing army as liberators of Christian kin. Others warned of a movement that threatened to disturb not only borders, but the entire balance of Europe. Within palaces, advisors attempted to read the meaning behind each maneuver. Was the march into these territories a bluff, a negotiating tactic, or the opening step of a campaign meant to shatter the old order in the Balkans? Messages flew between capitals by courier and telegraph. Envoys urged caution, even as they admitted the stakes were rising. For all the civilized language of their dispatches, the fear was simple. If one empire succeeded in redrawing the map around the Black Sea, others would be forced to follow or risk irrelevance. As fields along the Danube filled with tents and watchfires, communities in the surrounding towns braced for new hardships. Local peasants heard conflicting stories. Some whispered that northern troops had come to defend them. Others insisted that war would soon scorch their land. Merchants worried that armies would requisition grain and livestock. Priests debated theological points that had suddenly become matters of state. Some held out hope for deliverance, while others recognized that the arrival of soldiers seldom brought salvation. Even as tensions mounted, not every power leapt toward war. In Vienna, ministers sought to guide events without joining the conflict outright. They feared that fighting alongside either side might fracture their multi-ethnic realm, where Slavic, Germanic, Magyar, and Latin communities all lived under one crown. Still, the sight of foreign troops in the Balkans stirred old anxieties. Mobilization notices spread through provincial capitals. Rail depots filled with reservists. Though these forces remained poised rather than deployed, their presence radiated pressure across the region. Meanwhile, Britain faced its own cross-currents. Admirals pressed for a firm stance, pointing toward maps that showed how control of certain straits might affect passage to Asia. Politicians argued over cost, necessity, and principle. In taverns and drawing rooms, citizens read stirring phrases in daily papers, portraying the Northern Empire as a looming menace. Public opinion began to shift, making neutrality a harder stance to defend. Some leaders saw this change as an opportunity to assert global authority. Others feared it was driving them toward a conflict with unpredictable consequences. France watched all of this with a different eye. Prestige, influence, and a desire to reclaim a place at the center of continental affairs shaped its decisions. To many in Paris, the dispute over holy sites offered a perfect stage to demonstrate vigor. Popular enthusiasm grew as crowds read dispatches describing an assertive national role in protecting sacred traditions. For the ruler who sought legitimacy through spectacle and achievement, each step toward involvement seemed both natural and necessary. By late spring, the tension had reached a point of no return. Negotiators tried one last time to craft a compromise, but mistrust now outweighed diplomacy. The occupation of the Danubian provinces remained a potent symbol of defiance. Religious claims, territorial fears, and national pride tangled into a web that no envoy could unravel. As armies fortified riverbanks and fleets gathered in Mediterranean harbors, observers across Europe sensed that the long peace, maintained through a fragile balance of caution and restraint, was giving way. At last, the powder trail laid by decades of rivalry came close to flame. Assemblies prepared declarations, commanders checked their maps, and families bid farewell to the young men summoned to service across plains, mountains, and harbors. The quiet began to shift into an uneasy murmur. Europe, once steadied by the memory of disastrous wars, now moved toward another conflict whose scale none could fully imagine. Even as summer heat lingered over the Bosporus, uncertainty shadowed the council halls of the empire that ruled its shores. Courtiers moved through dim corridors, whispering over documents sealed with foreign crests. One message reported that the envoy from the northern court had departed in anger, abandoning negotiations after his demands met firm resistance. Another note warned that foreign fleets were preparing for possible action should persuasion fail. Ministers gathered around long tables, aware that each passing hour narrowed their choices. Within those chambers, the debate raged. Senior advisors urged caution, warning that their armies, though loyal, lacked the resources of their rivals. Others insisted that accepting a protector over millions of subjects who prayed in the Eastern Rite would unravel the empire's dignity. Younger officers, eager to prove themselves, argued that retreat now would invite greater demands later. The ruler listened to each faction, knowing that whatever path he chose would reshape the future. When the final decision came, it was not announced with triumph, but with solemn acceptance. The empire would stand firm. Across the Black Sea, confidence swelled among generals who believed their southern move would force concessions. Regiments marched into the Danubian principalities, raising flags over towns accustomed to shifting masters. Officers assured local villagers that their arrival promised protection. Many inhabitants greeted them cautiously, unsure whether liberation or hardship followed in their wake. Farms near the frontier lost grain and livestock to competing requisitions, a reminder that armies marching in the name of peace often carried war in their shadows. This occupation stirred shock far beyond the Danube. In Paris, political salons buzzed with excitement and outrage. In London, newspapers splashed dramatic headlines across their first pages. Though the details varied, most accounts agreed on one point. The old balance of power was under threat. Crowds gathered at docks and train stations, hoping for glimpses of officers returning from diplomatic posts, eager to hear their stories firsthand. Every rumor fed a growing belief that the continent was sliding toward calamity. Inside the French imperial palace, advisors recognized that public mood offered their leader an opportunity. For months, he had insisted that the religious dispute in the holy places demanded a strong response. Now, with new reports arriving daily about movements along the Danube, he felt the moment ripened. He ordered fleets prepared and sent messages of solidarity to Constantinople, framing his actions as defense of ancient rights behind the scenes. Many understood that the crisis allowed France to regain stature lost in earlier decades. Across the Channel, similar conversations unfolded in the smoky chambers of Parliament. Naval captains returned from the Mediterranean with stories of rising tension. Conservative ministers insisted that unchecked southern expansion by the northern power would endanger trade routes and strategic footholds. Liberals argued the state should avoid entanglements that might drain resources. Yet the image of an empire moving deeper into the Balkans, combined with accounts of demands placed upon Constantinople, eroded hesitation. By autumn, editors and public speakers described the crisis as a test of national resolve. Meanwhile, the Danube front grew more complicated. Local rulers, who nominally governed the principalities, found themselves trapped between great powers. Their formal allegiance lay with the empire in Constantinople, yet the forces occupying their lands declared themselves protectors of the Orthodox faithful merchants in river towns, struggled to continue their trade as checkpoints multiplied and taxes fluctuated. Priests faced congregations torn between loyalty to long-standing traditions and fear of political reprisals. In this uncertain climate, whispers of rebellion rose and fell, depending on which patrols passed through the streets. As the political temperature rose, Vienna stepped into the shadows of the conflict. Its ministers called emergency councils to evaluate the danger posed by the sudden presence of northern troops so near their borders. Memories of uprisings that had shaken their territories in 1848 remained painfully fresh. Many feared that if the northern court gained dominance in the Balkans, Slavic subjects within their own empire might seek new inspiration. Mobilization orders circulated quietly. Regiments gathered along key routes without officially declaring their intentions. Diplomats sent warnings to both sides, hoping that words alone might diffuse the situation. In the imperial capital by the Bosporus, the arrival of foreign envoys did little to ease tensions. These representatives brought assurances of support, but also subtle reminders of what their governments expected in return. Some demanded reforms. Others requested increased influence over certain provinces. The ruler of the city listened carefully, balancing desperation for allies against the risk of surrendering autonomy. Each visitor left with polite reassurances, though no one doubted the strain behind the courteous masks. When a message from the northern emperor reached Constantinople, carrying thinly veiled threats of broken relations, the final threads of diplomacy frayed. That note spoke of sacred duty and the protection of millions of believers, framing the empire's refusal as an affront to faith. Council members who had earlier urged compromise now found themselves isolated military commanders, sensing their moment pressed for action. They insisted that their forces, though imperfect, could withstand early clashes until aid from abroad arrived. Preparations began with haste. Messengers raced across Anatolia, summoning provincial regiments. Workshops in coastal towns worked to repair artillery long left idle. Even as these actions unfolded, uncertainty gnawed at the leadership. They knew their enemy possessed one of the largest armies on Earth, though much of it was tied down by distance, climate, and logistical strain. They hoped those disadvantages would buy precious time. Across the sea, confidence shifted into impatience. Northern commanders believed that occupying the principalities would soon bring negotiations to a favorable conclusion. But as weeks passed and no surrender came, their interpretation changed. Some viewed the Ottoman preparations as a bluff. Others warned that French and British encouragement might embolden the Sultan's court. The longer their regiments remained in foreign provinces, the more their presence appeared not as leverage, but as provocation. When the final declaration came from Constantinople, it reached European capitals like a crack of thunder. The empire had formally announced war bells tolled. Crowds surged through streets, and newspapers rushed special editions into circulation. In Paris, cheers echoed through boulevards as citizens proclaimed their commitment to defending the rights of Catholic communities in the Holy Land. In London, somber commentary mixed with patriotic fervor as the public weighed the cost of distant conflict. In Vienna, ministers locked themselves in fierce debate, unwilling to be drawn directly into the struggle, yet unwilling to let events proceed unchecked. Across the Black Sea, High Command received instructions to prepare for offensive action. The first winter passed with minor skirmishes along the Danube. But as spring approached, more serious plans took shape. Commanders targeted key fortresses such as Vidin and Silistra, intending to open a route towards Slavic allies in the Balkans. Yet the garrisons defending these positions proved more resilient than expected. Observers noted their stoic discipline as they rebuilt earthworks under fire, refusing to abandon their posts even as casualties mounted. While the Danube campaign unfolded, unrest simmered in the Caucasus. There, tribal confederations and mountain communities attempted to seize the moment, hoping that the broader war might weaken Russian control. Some achieved temporary successes, but the vast distances and limited resources prevented widespread uprisings. Russian officers, familiar with the region's harsh terrain, countered with determination. These engagements, though smaller than the battles along the Danube, drained men and supplies that commanders would later miss. In coastal capitals, the declaration of war triggered swift naval preparations. British yards worked through cold nights to ready ships capable of confronting the formidable Black Sea fleet, stationed in southern harbours. French dock workers hauled crates of ammunition onto vessels bound for the Mediterranean. Across Europe, families watched loved ones board trains and ships with anxious pride. Many believed the war would be quick. Few imagined how long the struggle would last or how deeply it would scar the continent. By early spring, the coalition forming behind Constantinople grew stronger. French and British diplomats sent firm warnings to the Northern Emperor, demanding withdrawal from the principalities. These ultimatums carried significant weight. In addition to military might, the moral force of two major powers acting in concert placed immense pressure on the occupiers. In the northern capital, advisors argued fiercely over whether to stand firm or retreat. Some urged defiance, claiming that backing down would shatter prestige. Others warned that defying both Western powers risked disaster. Ultimately, the presence of Austrian forces massed near the Carpathians tipped the scale. Though Vienna had not declared war, its mobilization sent a clear message. If the conflict engulfed the Balkans, The Habsburg realm might be drawn in to prevent any shift that could threaten its own survival. Facing the possibility of fighting three powers at once, the Northern Emperor reluctantly ordered a withdrawal from Moldavia, and Wallachia troops marched back across the Pruth River, leaving behind uncertain populations who had hoped for protection or feared retaliation. This retreat produced confusion throughout Europe. Some interpreted it as a sensible step toward peace. Others believed it signaled temporary hesitation before a larger confrontation. Meanwhile, French and British planners saw the moment as proof that combined pressure could restrain their rival. Emboldened, they moved warships deeper into the eastern Mediterranean and prepared for more decisive involvement. In Constantinople, leaders welcomed the withdrawal, but refused to relax. They still faced an adversary with vast manpower and resources, and they suspected that the Northern Army would regroup for another offensive. They also understood that the principalities remained vulnerable. Any lapse in attention could invite new incursions. So they continued to fortify river positions and mobilize reserves. Summer brought little clarity. The Danube frontier remained tense but quiet. Forces on both sides waited for instructions, weary from endless drills and rumors. Meanwhile, political developments abroad accelerated. In London, the cabinet debated whether to send troops to support the Ottomans directly across France. Grand speeches championed intervention as a matter of honor and justice. The press amplified every movement near the front, turning distant affairs into household conversation. By August, Allied fleets arrived in greater numbers. Their presence alone changed the strategic picture. Coastal communities along the Black Sea scanned the horizon, unsure whether the arrival of these foreign vessels promised safety or upheaval. Some welcomed the sight of powerful warships. Others worried that bombardments or landings might follow. As autumn approached, the final steps toward open conflict unfolded. Diplomats met for frantic discussions, but found no remaining room for compromise. None of the powers wished to retreat from positions they had so publicly defended. The Danube fortresses, the holy places, and the rights of Christian subjects had become symbols tied to national honor. With such stakes, negotiation became all but impossible. When Britain and France declared war, they framed their decision as an obligation to preserve order and protect the Ottoman realm. Celebrations erupted in their capitals, but many citizens also braced for the realities to come. Troop transports filled harbors, regiments assembled, and fleets set sail toward unfamiliar shores. Thus, the conflict that began with disputes over keys and lamp oils in ancient shrines expanded into a continental crisis. Far from the stone alleys of Bethlehem where priests quarreled, Europe now prepared for a war that would reach across mountains, seas, and steppe. The long peace forged after Napoleon had cracked. What followed would test not only the armies that marched toward Crimea, but the very foundations of the order that had held Europe together for decades. The storm had finally broken, and once declarations rang out across Europe, the first movements toward open battle followed with unnerving speed. Fleets that had long lingered in the eastern Mediterranean raised anchor, their hulls groaning as they cut through darkening swells. Soldiers aboard these ships stared toward distant shores, uncertain what waited for them beyond the horizon. But while these armadas gathered strength, the earliest sparks of the conflict ignited not at sea, but along the river that divided empires. Winter clung stubbornly to the Danubian plains when advance patrols first clashed in the cold fog. On both sides, officers expected only brief exchanges, tests of readiness rather than decisive action. Yet each shot carried symbolic weight. The armies facing one another understood that the quiet months of maneuvering and negotiation had ended. Snow-coated earthworks rose along the riverbanks, and scouts moved between frost-bent reeds, searching for weak points in the opposing line. Each regiment knew reinforcements were weeks away, but pride demanded they demonstrate resolve. By early March of 1853, the Empire on the Bosporus pressed its claim with certainty, unwilling to retreat after so much preparation. Orders travelled down the chain of command, instructing units to cross the river, where possible, and probe positions held by northern forces. The initial engagements were tentative. Riflemen traded fire from behind low walls. Artillery batteries exchanged scattered salvos, and mounted detachments tested flanks with quick advances before pulling back. Though casualties remained light, the tension inside every camp swelled with each hour. The army advancing from the north had expected an easier start. Commanders believed their opponents would crumble under the weight of superior numbers and long-standing weaknesses. When the first Ottoman counterattacks pushed back several companies, these officers reassessed their assumptions. Reports flowing into headquarters described well-built redoubts and fresh ranks of infantry who fought with a determination not seen in earlier wars. Strategists realized the campaign would require more than intimidation. It demanded persistent operational pressure. As the riverbanks turned muddy with spring thaw, planning on both sides grew more ambitious. The Northern High Command, hoping to secure momentum, while allies of the Ottoman court were still mobilizing, ordered concentrated pressure on strategic crossings that led toward the Balkans. They believed that by capturing key fortresses along the Danube, they could disrupt communications between Constantinople and its European provinces. More importantly, taking such positions would give them control of the routes that led toward the heart of the peninsula. While these preparations unfolded, life in the river towns underwent a rapid transformation. Inhabitants of Silistra, Vidin, and nearby settlements watched columns of troops march through their streets carrying crates of ammunition and supplies. Children followed the soldiers, fascinated by their uniforms, while merchants attempted to keep shops open despite unpredictable curfews. Women filled wells and ovens late into the night, understanding that once heavy shelling began, their neighborhoods could be cut off from the rest of the town. Meanwhile, the ruling court in Constantinople received messages from its commanders describing both promise and peril. They celebrated the spirited defense of their fortifications, yet warned of mounting strain. The empire's troops had fought well so far, but they faced an adversary with deeper reserves and shorter supply lines. These realities pushed leaders to appeal more urgently to allies abroad. Britain and France had already declared support. Now the Ottoman ministers urged them to act. Support arrived swiftly at sea. The first Allied squadrons steamed toward the Black Sea, crossing narrow straits where local fishermen gazed in awe at the massive silhouettes passing by. Each vessel bore the weight of industrial might, iron-reinforced hulls, precision artillery, and stores of equipment designed to sustain long voyages. Even before these ships reached their final destinations, their presence shifted calculations at every command table. The Northern Fleet could no longer assume dominance of the Black Sea. It now faced technologically advanced opponents with powerful naval traditions. On land, however, the Ottomans continued to shoulder the early burden. When the Northern Command launched a renewed offensive along the Danube, the defenders met them with unexpected ferocity. At one stretch of the river, heavy rains had swollen the waters, forcing attackers to seek crossings farther east. As they attempted to throw pontoon bridges across the churning current, artillery on the opposite bank opened fire, planks splintered, boats overturned, and men were swept downstream. Only after repeated attempts did infantry manage to establish a foothold. and even then, counterattacks harassed them relentlessly. Just as plans for a large-scale assault took shape, news from the Black Sea stunned European capitals. A northern squadron had intercepted an Ottoman fleet anchored under poor protection and attacked without hesitation. Explosive shells rained upon wooden vessels, igniting fires visible for miles. Plumes of smoke billowed over the water as sailors struggled to escape the inferno. Within hours, several ships lay in smoldering ruins. Survivors were pulled ashore in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. Reports of the destruction spread rapidly through international papers, with many describing the event as a massacre. Across Europe, outrage surged. In Britain, the public demanded a firm response, viewing the attack as a brutal assault on a weaker ally. In France, officials cited the incident as proof that their intervention carried moral urgency. Politicians who had hesitated earlier now spoke of duty and honor. When foreign secretaries met that winter, they concluded that limited measures would no longer suffice. They resolved to commit forces fully to the struggle. As these decisions solidified, the situation along the Danube shifted again. The offensive launched by the Northern Army progressed slowly, impeded by the resilience of defenders and the increasing likelihood of Allied intervention. Reports from naval observers indicated that British and French fleets were drawing closer to the conflict zone. Officers in Vienna, alarmed by the prospect of foreign troops on their doorstep, redoubled their pressure. They urged the Northern Emperor to withdraw from the principalities altogether, warning that continued occupation risked regional upheaval. The Northern Court debated fiercely. Some generals insisted that retreat would undermine their credibility. Others argued that the arrival of Western fleets and the mobilization of Austrian forces threatened encirclement. Ultimately, geography and logistics forced a difficult choice. The Danubian positions, though symbolically important, offered limited advantages compared to the dangers of confronting three powers simultaneously. Reluctantly, commanders ordered a staged withdrawal from the river fortresses, leaving behind only token garrisons to maintain observation. This withdrawal created a vacuum that changed everything. Though the Ottoman defenders of Silistra and Vidin celebrated, their leaders recognized the retreat not as an end, but a prelude. Their opponents had not abandoned their ambitions. They had merely shifted their focus. The Danube had become uncertain ground for securing any decisive result. If the war was to continue, and all signs indicated it would, the struggle would migrate to regions where naval superiority and daring could influence the outcome. As river skirmishes dwindled, a different theatre gained prominence. In the port of Varna, Allied armies began to arrive in force. The harbour, usually home to a modest fleet of merchant vessels, now bustled with steamships and transports. French infantry marched down gangplanks in tight formation, their boots striking the wooden planks in rhythmic unison. British regiments followed, hauling equipment and ammunition through narrow streets lined with curious villagers. Ottoman officers greeted their allies with formal ceremonies, though beneath the surface all sides understood the complexity of coordinating three languages, differing tactics, and competing priorities. The camps outside Varna stretched across rolling hills overlooking the sea. Rows of tents fluttered in the breeze, their white canvas glowing in the sunlight. Smoke rose from hastily built cook fires as soldiers prepared meals after long voyages. Yet the beauty of the coastline did little to ease the discomfort. Supplies remained limited, and fresh water proved difficult to secure. Worse still, disease appeared just as the armies attempted to organize cholera swept through the camps, claiming dozens of lives each day. Doctors struggled to contain the outbreak, but contaminated wells and close quarters thwarted their efforts. Despite these challenges, planners met daily in makeshift headquarters to determine their next step. At first, they debated whether to march north along the coastline to support attacks further inland. But with the Northern Army pulling out of the principalities, that option lost urgency. Discussions shifted toward a bolder strategy. The heart of the opposing powers' influence in the region lay across the Black Sea, a rugged peninsula crowned by a fortress city brimming with ships and artillery. If that stronghold could be seized, the entire regional balance would shift. Maps of that distant shore lay spread across tables lit by oil lamps. Officers traced routes with gloved fingers, estimating where landings could occur and how supplies might reach the front. Their confidence grew as they considered the wide array of vessels at their disposal. Allied dominance at sea meant they could choose their moment and location. Thus, the daring plan to land on the Crimean Peninsula emerged, not as a reckless gamble, but as a calculated blow aimed at a vulnerable cornerstone of imperial power. Before any fleet could set sail, however, the armies at Varna had to recover from disease and reorganize their ranks. Coffins lined the dusty roads leading to military hospitals. Funeral parties marched silently past rows of tents, their presence reminding every unit of the fragility of life far from home. Yet the determination to press forward remained strong. Officers trained their men rigorously in amphibious exercises, familiarizing them with the movements they would soon execute on hostile shores. The port itself transformed into a hive of preparation. Carpenters repaired wagons and built makeshift piers to accommodate the heavy influx of equipment. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes and sword guards late into the night. Sailors carried crates of ammunition to naval artillery crews, standing ready near the docks everywhere. Murmurs circulated about the impending operation. Some soldiers felt apprehension at the thought of crossing open water into unknown terrain. Others embraced the challenge with eagerness, convinced that victory awaited on the distant peninsula. By late summer, the decision formalized. The Allied command resolved to launch the invasion as soon as weather permitted. Messages traveled across the sea, informing the Ottoman court of the plan and requesting coordination. Commanders along the Danube received new directives to hold their positions, while the main campaign moved elsewhere. For the first time since the war began, attention shifted decisively away from the riverfronts and toward the horizon. Armies at Varna began to dismantle their camps, loading wagons and carrying crates toward the shore. Ships waited in neat lines, their flags snapping in the wind. As men prepared to embark, many cast final glances at the countryside, where they had endured sickness and uncertainty. Despite the hardships, the months spent at Varna had forged a bond between soldiers who had arrived as strangers from different nations. Now they faced an even greater trial together. When the transports finally weighed anchor, their prows turned toward the Black Sea. A collective sense of purpose settled over the decks. The early battles along the Danube had revealed the scale of the challenge. The destruction at sea had galvanized Western resolve. The gathering at Varna had shaped the next phase. What lay ahead was a daring strike at the heart of imperial power, a landing on distant shores that would determine the war's future. And so the armada advanced, sails taut, furnaces glowing red beneath iron plates, all heading toward a peninsula whose name would soon be spoken across continents. The war was no longer a series of border clashes. It was becoming something far larger. The armada pushing through the Black Sea moved as a floating city, its decks crowded with soldiers gazing toward a horizon they had never seen. Metal creaked under shifting waves, and the wind carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, brine, and anticipation. Weeks earlier, these same men had suffered in the fever-ridden camps of Varna. Now the sickness that once stalked their tents felt strangely distant. Ahead lay something larger than recovery, an expedition meant to strike directly at the heart of imperial pride. Even as their ships advanced through restless waters, news of the disaster at Sinope still echoed through every mess hall. Many had not witnessed the fiery destruction themselves, but they needed only to listen to those who had sailed past the smouldering wreckage afterward. Tales of shattered masts, burned hulls, and bodies drifting on blackened waves had circulated between regiments. The image hardened resolve among the Western forces. Officers who once hesitated now found themselves urging greater commitment, convinced that nothing but bold action would end the threat embodied by the Northern Fleet. Far behind them, the political fallout had already reshaped Europe. Newspapers across London and Paris printed illustrations of blazing Ottoman ships beneath volleys of explosive shells. Some papers declared the attack dishonorable. Others claimed it revealed a willingness to impose dominance on weaker neighbors. Public pressure surged until governments could no longer debate half measures. By the time the Armada neared its destination, Allied intervention had become not only a matter of strategy, but of national pride. Still, operational clarity took time to form. The Danube front had stalled, neither side seizing the decisive breakthrough early planners had imagined. Thus, the next phase of the war shifted away from river valleys and into open water. By moving troops onto the Crimean coast, the alliance hoped to strike at a naval base that housed fleets capable of threatening the eastern Mediterranean. If they captured that stronghold, they could sever the empire's reach beyond its southern borders. As the fleet pressed forward, commanders aboard the flagship pored over maps of the peninsula. Their charts varied in detail, some marked with old surveys, others based on sketches taken by merchant sailors. All agreed that the chosen landing point, an empty stretch of shoreline near Eupatoria, offered relative safety. Scouts believed local garrisons were small and unprepared for an assault, yet officers remained cautious. Intelligence reports from earlier years hinted at shifting sandbars and unpredictable currents that could complicate disembarkation. Navigators studied each contour carefully to avoid grounding vessels on hidden shoals. The journey across the Black Sea tested every nerve. Storms swept down from the north without warning, throwing waves against hulls in towering arcs. One night, winds howled so fiercely that lanterns had to be extinguished to prevent them from toppling and igniting wooden decks. Soldiers braced themselves against rails, gripping knotted ropes as rain lashed across their faces. Some whispered prayers, others stared defiantly into the storm. Only after midnight did the squall die away, revealing a sky filled with cold, brilliant stars. The movement of constellations guided navigators as the Armada resumed formation. While the fleet battled nature, inland forces along the Danube felt the conflict shifting away from their trenches. Generals who had once prepared for major assaults now received orders to hold their lines, rather than pursue offensive action. Though confused at first, many understood the reasoning. If the Allied armies succeeded in Crimea, the riverfront would lose its strategic value. Russian withdrawal from the principalities confirmed this perspective. Local populations, uncertain which banners would fly next, watched from a distance as troops dismantled camps and withdrew in long, somber columns. In a remarkable twist, oversight of the principalities temporarily fell to Vienna. Austrian troops marched into empty garrisons, their appearance greeted with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Shopkeepers reopened stores, believing the new arrivals would maintain relative peace. Farmers brought goods into marketplaces, though they set aside a portion of their harvest as a precaution, knowing that occupying soldiers often required more than polite welcome. Even as they restored order, Austrian commanders sent coded warnings to both sides, reminding them that any renewed struggle in the region risked drawing the Habsburg realm deeper into the conflict. Back aboard the Allied transports, anticipation mounted when a faint line of coastline appeared at dawn. Within hours, that distant shadow resolved into rolling plains and rocky headlands. Officers shouted orders in French, Ottoman Turkish, and English, guiding soldiers toward their designated stations. Stoic sailors maneuvered ships into parallel lines, ready to lower boats at the signal. The air vibrated with tension as troops tightened straps on haversacks and checked their rifles. The operation ahead required precision. Any misstep during landing could expose the force to devastating fire. Yet the expected resistance never materialized. As boats pushed toward shore, scouts observed only scattered groups of local villagers and a handful of mounted patrols riding along the distant hills. Many of the inhabitants were Crimean Tatars, who had little loyalty to the empire ruling from St. Petersburg, and even less desire to confront a massive invasion fleet. Resistance, if attempted, would have been futile. The landing proceeded smoothly, with soldiers jumping into shallow surf and planting standards in the wet sand. Men cheered as the first contingent formed ranks without interruption. As more troops climbed ashore, a logistical struggle began. The coastline lacked natural harbors, forcing units to improvise. Planks were hauled from boats to construct makeshift piers. Crates of ammunition and sacks of flour were carried ashore in long lines as waves crashed at their knees. Horses, terrified by the motion of rowboats, had to be blindfolded before handlers coaxed them into the water to swim the final distance. Still, by evening, the majority of the Allied force stood secure on the peninsula, looking inland toward a seemingly endless expanse of open ground. That night, campfires flickered beneath a sky bright with unfamiliar stars. The quiet did not mask the fragile reality of their position. Though the landing had succeeded, the siege of the fortress city ahead promised a far more grueling ordeal. No one doubted the determination of the defenders. Stories had already spread about the city's fortifications. Vast stone bastions, networks of trenches, and artillery lines positioned with masterful precision. To reach that city, the Allies would first need to cross rivers, ravines, and ridges, all while transporting artillery and supplies across rough terrain. While the Allies established their presence on the peninsula, turmoil rippled through the Russian command structure. The surprise landing forced officers to re-evaluate their plans. They had anticipated a renewed Danube campaign, or perhaps limited coastal raids, but not a full-scale invasion striking directly at their naval stronghold. Couriers galloped across dusty roads to gather reinforcements. Local garrisons received urgent orders to muster volunteers, militia, and irregulars to bolster defensive lines. For the first time since the war began, commanders sensed they might lose the strategic initiative. In Sevastopol, tension grew palpable. The city that served as the empire's primary southern harbor now faced an unprecedented threat. Workshops hammered late into the night to repair cannons and produce ammunition. Civilians volunteered to dig earthworks alongside soldiers, forming hastily built barricades and trenches along vulnerable approaches. Engineers studied the terrain, selecting vantage points from which sharpshooters could delay the enemy advance. Rumor spread that the Allies intended not merely to blockade, but to take the city by storm. The first major clash came only days after the landing. As the Allied column advanced inland, scouts spotted dust clouds on the horizon. A Russian force, hastily assembled, took positions along the heights overlooking the Alma River. The ground they chose offered a formidable advantage: steep ridges, narrow paths, and an unobstructed field of fire. A natural barrier now separated the invaders from the road to Sevastopol. Officers on both sides understood that this would be the first true test of the campaign. At dawn, Allied battalions assembled along the riverbank. The water, though shallow, glimmered like polished steel in the early light. Soldiers crouched behind scrubby bushes and low embankments, waiting for the order to advance. Artillery thundered across the valley, with each explosion sending flocks of birds into panicked flight. The French moved first, attempting to scale the heights under a curtain of fire. Their distinctive uniforms marked bright streaks across the rugged slope. Shouts and rifle cracks echoed through the air as enemy skirmishers contested every inch. While the French pushed on one flank, British units prepared to cross the river more centrally. Officers waved their sabres, urging their men forward. The water slowed progress more than expected. Smooth stones shifted beneath boots, causing some soldiers to slip and lose footing. Yet they pressed on, climbing embankments under the watchful eyes of Russian artillerymen above casualties mounted, but determination carried them forward. Amid this chaos, Ottoman contingents on the Allied left performed maneuvers that helped shield French units from enfilading fire. Though their numbers on the field were smaller, their actions contributed to maintaining the momentum that prevented Russian units from executing a coordinated counterattack. As the day wore on, the defenders' lines buckled. Waves of reinforcements attempted to restore order, but the angles of the terrain and the intensity of Allied fire made a sustained stand impossible. By late afternoon, the Allied forces held the ridge. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, obscuring the ground where thousands had fallen. The river glimmered faintly beneath the haze as stretcher-bearers transported the wounded across makeshift bridges. Many now understood that the march ahead would demand even greater sacrifice. The victory, though decisive, revealed the determination of the defenders and the sobering reality of assaulting fortified positions deeper inland. Once the last shots faded, the Allied generals gathered to decide their next move. Some argued for pressing forward immediately to strike the fortress before reinforcements arrived. Others insisted the troops required rest after the grueling battle. The debate stretched into the night, illuminated by lanterns swaying in the breeze. Ultimately, caution prevailed. The Allied commanders opted to march south around the city, choosing to take positions from which they could lay siege, rather than gamble everything on a single assault. This decision shaped the entire character of the coming war. Instead of a swift campaign, resolved in weeks, the conflict drifted toward a prolonged struggle. The armies now faced months of digging trenches, constructing batteries, and enduring the harsh realities of a Crimean winter. For now, however, those challenges lay beyond the horizon. What mattered in the present was momentum. With the Alma behind them and the Black Sea at their backs, the great coalition turned its gaze toward the stronghold ahead. The road to Sevastopol awaited, a path lined with hardship, heroism, miscalculation, and a siege that would soon become one of the defining ordeals of the century. The march toward the fortress had begun. The march southward began before the smoke of Alma had fully cleared. Columns moved out at dawn, stepping past scorched grass and abandoned knapsacks left behind by those who no longer walked among them. Drums kept the pace steady, though many men favored silence, unwilling to disturb the uneasy calm that followed a day of carnage. Above them, gulls wheeled in the bright morning air, indifferent to the suffering left in their wake. Ahead stretched a coastline of cliffs and rolling ridges, the path that would lead them towards Sevastopol. Each regiment advanced along narrow tracks carved by ox carts and shepherds long before war transformed the peninsula. Dust rose around the feet of thousands, coating boots and uniforms in a grey film that clung stubbornly to skin and fabric. The heat of late September pressed heavily upon them, though occasional breezes from the sea brought brief relief. Officers rode along the flanks checking the alignment of companies, while interpreters attempted to communicate with local guides who spoke of ravines, wells, and hidden copses of trees where scouts might encounter enemy pickets. As the army pressed deeper inland, the landscape changed. Sparse coastline gave way to rolling farmland dotted with vineyards. Though many fields now lay abandoned, Crimean Tatar villages stood quiet, their inhabitants watching cautiously from behind walls or from the edges of orchards. Some approached the column, offering fruit or small casks of water. Others withdrew into the hills, fearful of both the invaders and the empire that ruled them. The alliance could not linger to reassure or punish. Every hour mattered. The stronghold still lay far ahead. Among the troops, conversation flowed in dozens of dialects. French zouaves joked with British fusiliers over tin cups of tepid water. Ottoman officers, mounted on wiry horses, spoke softly with scouts who traced enemy movements across the southern ridges. Sardinian observers rode alongside higher-ranking commanders, learning the terrain and taking notes for the day their own regiments might join the fighting. Though backgrounds differed, the hardships of the campaign bound them gradually into a single force, moving toward a common purpose. Progress slowed when the vanguard encountered a series of streams winding across their path. These waters, swollen by recent rains, cut through the land in steep banks that forced engineers to construct makeshift bridges. Logs were dragged from distant groves, bound with ropes, and pushed into the muddy earth to form crossing points. The delays frustrated many officers, but they also provided moments of rest. Soldiers leaned against their packs, grateful for a brief pause in the march, while cavalry horses drank eagerly from the cool shallows. News from ahead came intermittently. Scouts reported enemy detachments withdrawing towards Sevastopol, abandoning outposts rather than risking another pitched battle so soon after Alma. The retreat was measured, not panicked. Commanders recognized they could not defend the open hills, and instead concentrated on strengthening the city's southern defenses. Every withdrawal left new earthworks behind, some prepared only in haste, others meticulously shaped by experienced engineers. Occasionally, the Allies found trenches so recently abandoned that embers still glowed in fire pits. As the main body advanced, the sea remained their companion. At times, the cliffs dropped sharply toward the surf, revealing narrow coves where waves crashed against jagged rocks. At other points, gentle slopes led down to beaches scattered with driftwood. Supply ships occasionally sailed parallel to the route, sending small boats ashore with crates of biscuits, ammunition, and medical chests. These moments lifted spirits. The men understood that their survival depended on the ability of the fleet to keep pace. Robust as the force looked from afar, illness continued to stalk the ranks. Cholera had not vanished with the camps of Varna. It lurked wherever water grew stagnant or wells had been contaminated by fleeing villagers. Surgeons did what they could, but the disease moved faster than treatment. At night, burial details carried bodies to shallow graves dug away from the bivouacs. The men tried to sleep despite the knowledge that some who lay beside them might not wake by morning. As they approached the Belbek River, where the terrain grew more broken, their route curved inland toward higher ground. Here the scenery shifted again. clusters of trees cast long shadows across open fields, and rocky outcroppings jutted from the slopes like the ribs of ancient beasts. The road they followed narrowed into a twisting path that forced the column to stretch out for miles. Officers worried that such dispersion might expose them to ambush, but no serious resistance materialized. Every visible sign pointed to a strategic withdrawal rather than a bold stand. Still, danger hovered. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, a distant rumble echoed across the hills. Soldiers halted, straining to hear. For a moment, silence returned. Then the sound came again, muffled but unmistakable. Artillery. Columns tightened formation instinctively. Officers rode forward to consult, dispatching couriers toward the front. When word returned, a sigh of relief followed. The thunder belonged not to the enemy, but to the Allied fleet, bombarding coastal batteries some miles away. The guns of the sea were clearing obstacles ahead. By early October, the army crested a ridge and saw for the first time the faint outlines of Sevastopol in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys and workshops within its walls. Ships rested in the harbour like shadows against the water. The sight held every eye. Some men felt awe, others felt dread. The great fortress was renowned not only for its walls, but for the discipline of the soldiers stationed there. Taking it by assault seemed impossible. Yet turning back now was unimaginable. The immediate challenge lay not in attacking the city, but in choosing how to approach it. Ahead, the northern defences appeared formidable. Thick stone bastions reinforced with fresh earthworks. Naval guns overlooked the harbour, ready to sweep any direct advance. To the south, however, the land sloped gently toward the outskirts and lacked major fortifications. It was here the Allied commanders decided to strike. The march veered southeast toward Balaclava, a harbour the Allies hoped to use as a supply base. The road dipped into valleys and climbed out again, passing fields where herds of cattle once grazed. Farmers had long since fled, leaving behind wooden ploughs, clay ovens, and shuttered homes. Soldiers peered into deserted courtyards, imagining the families who had once lived there. Some found chickens still roaming freely. Others encountered dogs guarding empty thresholds, barking at the passing regiments with unwavering loyalty. When at last the column approached Balaclava, they found a narrow inlet protected by steep hills and dotted with small fishing huts. The harbour, though modest, offered shelter from the open sea and a place to anchor transports. Engineers assessed the terrain and declared it suitable for establishing a depot. Work began immediately. Piers extended into the water. Warehouses rose from the shoreline. Trenches carved into the surrounding hills offered defensive positions overlooking approaches from inland. With Balaclava secured, attention shifted toward the long ridgeline stretching northwest, the ground from which siege lines could be drawn toward Sevastopol. Commanders climbed the nearest hill to survey the landscape. Before them lay an undulating plain, dotted with vineyards, stone farmhouses, and orchards. Beyond these, darker shapes marked the positions where Russian engineers labored day and night, building new fortifications that linked the city to the surrounding hills. Smoke from their forges drifted upward in twisted plumes. The southern slope leading toward the city revealed the scale of the task ahead. Artillery needed to be hauled up steep inclines. Trenches had to be dug across unforgiving soil. Supply lines required protection from roaming cavalry. Yet the commanders agreed that if they could establish their siege lines here, they could gradually tighten their grip on the city. Attacking from the north would invite disaster, but from the south, persistence and firepower might eventually wear the defenders down. Thus began the last stage of their approach. Regiments moved to their designated positions. Shovels broke ground as earthworks took shape. Wagons rattled over uneven paths, delivering powder, shot, and building materials. Tents appeared along ridges, forming temporary settlements where soldiers prepared for the long ordeal ahead. At night, lanterns glowed like stars scattered across the hills. Despite the urgency, the army had not left all dangers behind. Russian patrols probed their flanks, testing the new positions. Occasional shots rang out in the darkness as pickets challenged approaching figures. Each moment reminded the Allies that the defenders watched every movement from the city's ramparts. Still, the march had achieved its purpose. The Great Coalition had reached the doorstep of the Empire's most prized port. The path from Alma to Balaclava had been marked by heat, dust, illness, and exhaustion. Yet it also carried the momentum of victory. Spirits lifted, if only cautiously. Behind them stood the sea, their lifeline. Ahead lay the first trenches of a siege that would soon consume their strength. No one yet grasped how long the struggle would last, nor how many would fall before the end. But as the Allied lines tightened and the sound of picks and shovels echoed across the hills, all understood that the next phase had begun. The road that had carried them across fields and rivers now ended at the gates of a fortress whose defenders had no intention of yielding. The siege was about to open, and the world would soon hold its breath. Night settled over the hills above Balaclava, with a quiet that felt unnatural after weeks of marching. The glow of campfires dotted the slopes, their flickering light revealing silhouettes bent over shovels and pickaxes. Fresh trenches took shape where only days earlier grapevines and grazing animals had stood. Every clang of metal on rock echoed toward the distant walls of Sevastopol, where watchmen could see the enemy reshaping the land, one stroke at a time. The siege had not formally begun, yet the first outlines of it were already etched into the earth. At dawn, officers rode the ridgeline to survey their progress. From that height, the Allied camps unfurled like an immense tapestry. Rows of tents lined the shallow valleys, broken by artillery parks and supply depots. Beyond the camps lay the winding road they had followed south, now a ribbon of churned dust leading back toward the shore. Closer still, the hills bristled with earthworks, breastworks built from stones pulled by hand, timber frames hammered together through the night, trenches deep enough to shield riflemen. It was a sprawling effort, improvised yet determined. But even as preparations took shape, disagreement stirred among the commanders. Some urged an immediate assault on the city before its defenders could fortify their positions further. They argued that the Russians, shaken by their defeat at Alma, would not withstand a swift and daring strike. Others countered that the city's northern bastions, connected by rugged terrain, made a frontal attack reckless. The southern side, though weaker, still required careful preparation and heavier artillery than the Allies currently possessed. A premature assault, they warned, might end in slaughter. The debate unfolded in tents lit by lanterns that cast wavering shadows across maps. Voices rose, fell, and clashed again. Each proposal carried risks, and each commander understood the cost of choosing wrongly. After hours of argument, the coalition settled on caution. They would circle the city, entrench along the heights, and conduct a formal siege, rather than gamble the entire campaign on a single storming of the defenses. The decision shaped the rest of the war, though no one yet grasped it. Once the order spread through the ranks, the direction of movement shifted. Instead of marching directly upon Sevastopol, the army angled southwest, keeping the sea on its right flank. Columns wound through ravines and narrow passes, pushing ever closer to the southern approaches. From above, the terrain resembled a broken fan, ridges radiating outward, each one overlooked by higher ground beyond it. To hold even one of these ridges offered advantage. To hold them all demanded relentless labor. The southern march was punishing. Supplies had grown heavy on the wagons since the landing, and the roads deteriorated by the day. Drivers cursed as wheels sank into ruts or broke against stones. Teams of horses strained to pull the loads uphill. Foot soldiers hacked at thorny shrubs to widen the path, clearing space for artillery teams that struggled to maneuver their guns along precarious slopes. Every few hours, the column halted to drag a cannon free from a ditch or repair a snapped axle. Local inhabitants watched the spectacle with mixed emotions. Some Crimean Tatars offered assistance, guiding scouts through terrain they knew intimately. Others kept their distance, wary of drawing attention from either side. Their villages, already ravaged by earlier requisitions, trembled between two forces that neither protected nor wholly trusted them. Stories later spread of families fleeing into distant hills, taking only what they could carry, uncertain which army posed the greater danger. After several days of grinding progress, the first reconnaissance parties reached vantage points overlooking the southern defenses. From the ridgeline, the city revealed itself more clearly than it had from the distant heights near Alma. The harbour curved inland like an iron hook, packed with ships whose masts resembled skeletal forests against the morning sky. Smoke spiraled from foundries where blacksmiths hammered metal into shape. Cannon muzzles jutted from bastions, their dark mouths surveying the approaches like silent sentinels. Engineers below scurried between trenches, organizing laborers who hauled baskets of earth to strengthen the ramparts. One thing was immediately clear. The defenders had not wasted time. Since receiving word of the Allied landing, the Russian command had poured every available hand into the southern works. Old seawalls had been reinforced with thick embankments. Barracks had been converted to firing positions. Churches and administrative buildings had been stripped of usable materials to feed the construction effort. Every hour brought new changes to the skyline, as laborers raised or relocated batteries according to the instructions of their tireless engineers. Foremost among these engineers stood a man whose name would soon be spoken in both camps with a mix of respect and frustration. His eye for terrain transformed simple ridges into formidable barriers. Every contour offered him possibilities, angles of fire, blind approaches, choke points. Under his direction, trenches appeared as though carved by invisible hands. He prowled the heights with a slate and chalk, issuing commands with calm precision, even when shells burst dangerously close. The Allies watched these developments with concern. Their own entrenchments were still shallow, their artillery not yet positioned. The defenders were turning the southern face of the city into a stone giant, with arms stretched across the hills. If the Allies delayed too long, assaulting those new works would prove increasingly costly. Yet rushing forward risked disaster. Before any serious bombardment could begin, they needed to secure a supply line from Balaclava, establish stable positions, and coordinate the efforts of their multinational force. In the Allied camps, hardship crept back into daily life. Rations diminished quickly, especially after a storm battered the coastline and sank several supply barges. Soldiers who had fought bravely at Alma now stood in long lines, waiting for bread or boiled grain, sometimes receiving only half portions. Water remained scarce. Wells near the new lines produced foul-smelling liquid that even the desperate hesitated to drink. Some regiments resorted to digging crude cisterns to catch rainwater, though early autumn offered too few storms to fill them adequately. Disease, always an unwelcome companion, slipped through the ranks again. Cholera flared in pockets of the camp, its signature cramps and fever rendering men helpless within hours. Medical officers moved from tent to tent, administering treatments with dwindling supplies. The sight of burial details once more pacing through the hills weighed heavily on morale soldiers who had endured Varna's horrors, now feared the sickness would stalk them even here, on the doorstep of their greatest objective. To make matters worse, the ground itself resisted every attempt to carve out shelter. The soil near the southern positions alternated between loose sand and stubborn stone. Picks chipped away slowly, sending sparks flying. Shovels bent under the strain. Men cursed as they worked, knowing that every hour of backbreaking labor offered only inches of progress. Yet they continued, driven by the knowledge that without these trenches, they stood exposed to the guns of the fortress. Night after night, the hills glowed with the fires of both armies. Rockets arced upward from the city's ramparts, illuminating the plain with ghostly light. Occasionally, a distant boom signaled a probing shot, fired not to kill, but to measure distance and test the resolve of the newcomers. Allied gunners responded cautiously, firing only when necessary to silence a particularly aggressive battery. Neither side wished to exhaust ammunition before the true siege began. As the Allies dug in, small skirmishes erupted along the flanks. Picket lines clashed in the darkness, exchanging musket fire. Before melting back into the night, mounted patrols darted across open ground to test the edges of enemy positions, sometimes returning with prisoners who revealed details of troop movements inside the city. These engagements rarely shifted the operational picture, but they sharpened the nerves of every soldier who now slept with a loaded rifle within reach. In early October, one development lifted spirits: the establishment of a more permanent base at Balaclava. Shiploads of supplies began to arrive more frequently, bringing flour, salted meat, boots, blankets, and bundles of letters from home. The arrival of these resources reminded the men that despite hardship, their nations had not forgotten them. Yet even this good fortune carried risks. Balaclava lay exposed behind thin lines, inviting counterattack. The defenders in Sevastopol certainly recognized this vulnerability. Meanwhile, artillery units finally reached the forward positions. Teams of horses strained as they dragged heavy guns up steep inclines, their hooves slipping on loose gravel. Once placed, the guns had to be secured with beams and sandbags to prevent recoil from sliding them downhill. Ammunition wagons arrived shortly after, their iron-rimmed wheels groaning under the weight of shells. Soon, batteries dotted the heights, though not yet in the dense concentration the siege would eventually require. Despite these advancements, the question that had hung over the commanders since Alma remained unresolved. Should they attempt to storm the city before winter set in? Or should they commit fully to a formal siege that could stretch into months? Reconnaissance reports revealed that defenders were not simply holding ground. They were reshaping it faster than the Allies could respond. Each day of construction made an assault less feasible, yet hesitation risked losing all momentum. While the debate continued, the defenders pushed their own reinforcements forward. Columns of infantry filed into the city under cover of darkness, their footsteps echoing through narrow streets. Naval batteries turned inward to protect key sectors. Civilians offered their labor, carrying stones, timber, and water to the front lines. Everywhere one looked, a sense of defiance gripped the inhabitants. They would not permit the city to fall without a siege worthy of its history. As the final weeks of September passed into October, the Allied command accepted the reality facing them. A storming of Sevastopol, however tempting, would only deliver men into the jaws of well-prepared defenses. The time for rapid marches had ended, The time for siege had begun. Messages circulated through the camps, informing regiments to prepare for prolonged operations. Engineers received new instructions. Artillery officers refined their positions. Infantry dug deeper into the hillsides, creating elaborate networks of trenches. With these preparations unfolding, dawn broke one morning to reveal the Allied lines fixed firmly across the southern heights. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires. Shovels glinted in the early light. Messengers rode between headquarters and the forward trenches. Ahead, the city's bastions loomed, their stone faces unblinking. Between them stretched a no-man's land of fields and ravines soon to be carved into scarred earth. The march was over. The siege was ready to begin. And with its beginning came the grim understanding that the struggle for the fortress would test every nation present. Not just in courage, but in endurance. Cold winds swept across the ridges as the first full days of siege work settled over the army. The trenches dug in haste now stretched like open wounds across the hills, their walls reinforced with sandbags and wicker gabions hauled up from balaclava. Every man knew the shape of the fighting had changed. No longer were they marching across open countryside toward a distant goal. Now they crouched behind banks of earth, staring toward a fortress that returned their gaze with unblinking resolve. The earliest exchanges came just after dawn. A sudden flash erupted from one of the higher Russian batteries, followed by a crack that rolled across the plain like thunder. Moments later, a shell plunged into an Allied work party, scattering dirt and stones. Shouts rang through the trench as survivors dragged the wounded aside. Before the echo faded, Allied guns answered from the ridge behind them, sending their own arcs of fire into the smoke rising from the enemy lines. These bursts marked the beginning of the first great bombardments. For hours at a time, the hills shook under the duel. Stones tumbled down the slopes. Dust clouds blossomed in the morning air, and fragments whirled dangerously above the trenches. Gunners worked in relentless rhythm. Ram, load, fire, recoil, repeat. Each movement practiced so often it resembled a grim dance. Sweat streaked through the powder on their faces. Horses reared as explosions pounded the ground beneath their hooves. Yet even as the Allies unleashed their fury, the walls of Sevastopol endured, strengthened daily by laborers who seemed unaffected by the violence around them. Those same laborers soon struck back. One night, as the moon rose behind a veil of thin clouds, alarms carried down the Allied line. A swarm of enemy riflemen surged from their forward trenches, their boots splashing through muddy gullies. They aimed not to seize ground permanently, but to disrupt the siege lines, taking advantage of darkness to attack pickets and work parties. The assault came with startling ferocity. Men half asleep grabbed rifles, stumbling from their shelters as shots cracked across the ridge. Within moments, the quiet night erupted into chaos. Flashes of musket fire stitched glowing arcs across the darkness. Calls for reinforcements echoed as units scrambled to plug gaps in the line engineers, who had been guiding workers in deepening the trenches, dropped their tools and took up arms. The attackers used the terrain expertly, slipping between rocks, firing from unexpected angles, then withdrawing before the Allies could mount a coordinated response. Though the sortie lasted less than an hour, its impact lingered. It showed the defenders would not passively endure the siege. They intended to bleed the attackers at every opportunity. When dawn finally arrived, the ground lay scattered with broken shovels, abandoned rifles, and the lifeless forms of those caught by surprise. Yet the work could not slow. Even as burial parties performed their somber duties, fresh work details were summoned. Shovels cut into the earth again, widening the trenches and strengthening the parapets. The siege had entered its grinding phase, where every sunrise brought more labor than rest. As October advanced, weather turned against them. Heavy rains swept across the heights, transforming the earth into a thick, clinging mire. Trenches that once offered shelter now filled with mud that pulled at boots until men staggered like drunkards. Water pooled at the bottom, forcing soldiers to stand in icy puddles that numbed their legs. Blankets soaked through quickly, and fires sputtered in the damp wind. Officers cursed the skies, watching helplessly as the elements did what Russian guns could not, sap the strength and spirit of the army. Worse still, the storms battered the coast with ferocity unseen in weeks. One particular tempest struck with almost biblical force. Waves taller than cottages crashed onto the piers of Balaclava, smashing crates and splintering timbers. Ships anchored offshore strained against their moorings until ropes snapped like thread. Several vessels carrying winter clothing and ammunition broke apart in the surf, their cargo swallowed by the sea before crews could intervene. Only after hours of roaring wind did the storms subside, leaving behind a shoreline littered with debris and bodies. When the scale of the disaster became clear, dread rippled through the camps. Winter coats, tents, and blankets meant to protect thousands had vanished into the depths. Ammunition lost to the waves threatened to slow the siege. Even food supplies had been damaged. Soldiers who had already endured scarcity now faced the prospect of bitter cold without adequate shelter. The knowledge settled over the trenches like a suffocating fog. Still, the siege continued. Gunners salvaged what shot they could, and infantry tightened their patrols to prevent further night assaults. Allied generals issued orders for new supply lines to be improvised from Balaclava to the forward positions. Wagons rolled up the steep track despite the mud, axles creaking and horses snorting in exhaustion. Drivers cursed with every jolt, yet they pressed on, knowing that the entire army relied on their efforts. Meanwhile, the defenders seized every opportunity to exploit the Allies' misfortune. Their sorties grew bolder. One evening, a sudden barrage from a high battery, concealed in brush-covered ravines, caught an entire working party exposed. Men scattered, diving for cover as shells burst above them. Another night, Russian riflemen infiltrated close enough to lob grenades into half-finished trenches. The explosions sent showers of earth and stone raining down on laborers who barely had time to react. Each attack forced the Allies to divert manpower from construction to defense, slowing progress at the very moment speed mattered most. Inside Sevastopol, life had become its own ordeal. Civilians huddled in cellars, while soldiers worked day and night to strengthen the city. Yet the same storms that tormented the Allies battered the defenders as well. Newly built batteries washed out in the rain, forcing engineers to shore them up again. Horses starved as fodder ran low. Sickness spread among men who labored in flooded trenches, with scarcely more comfort than their besiegers. Both sides learned the same harsh truth. The Crimean autumn showed mercy to no one. In the Allied trenches, exhaustion turned the simplest tasks into burdens. Men stood watch with eyes half closed, drifting towards sleep before jolting awake as rifle shots cracked through the night. Many slept in wet uniforms, waking shivering and coughing. Yet their greatest trial came not from weather or hunger, but from the constant knowledge that each hour brought them no closer to ending the siege. The city's defenses seemed to grow taller by the day, while their own trenches deepened so slowly, it felt as though the earth resisted every attempt to be shaped. Despite the gloom, moments of resolve flickered through the ranks. When the sky cleared one morning, sunlight touched the hills with a faint golden sheen. Soldiers emerged from their shelters to stretch stiff limbs. Artillery crews used the reprieve to dry powder stores and repair damaged gun carriages. Engineers laid new planks across mud-filled trenches to prevent further injury. That same day, the first reinforcements from the fleet arrived. Fresh uniforms, boots, and limited medical supplies. Though not enough to erase the hardships, these deliveries reminded the men that help still reached them even in the storm's aftermath. New batteries soon rose along the ridge. Their embrasures pointed towards Sevastopol's southern forts. Each emplacement represented hours of labor performed under fire. When the gunners finally wheeled their pieces into place, they did so with a reverence born from exhaustion. They had carved these perches from unforgiving ground, and now they intended to use them. As the final week of October approached, the lines had stabilized. Smoke from the city's chimneys drifted across the ravines. Allied trenches stretched like scars along the hillsides. Both armies had endured storms, shortages, and deadly surprises, and yet both prepared for the next escalation. For all knew the siege could not remain static. One side or the other would soon take action to change the balance. In those moments of uneasy calm, the soldiers on the heights gazed toward the enemy positions and understood what lay ahead. The opening stage of the siege had cost them dearly, yet the struggle was only beginning. Winter loomed, and with it new trials neither camp could yet imagine. The fortress still stood, and the armies before it braced for the blows to come. The unease that settled over the trenches during late October did not last long. Before dawn one morning, distant hoofbeats carried across the ravines, steady at first, then multiplying into a thunder that rolled through the valley. Torches flared atop outposts. Sentinels leaned forward, straining to pierce the grey haze that clung to the low ground. The stillness that had hung between the siege lines fractured in an instant. The defenders were on the move. At first light, the scale of their advance became clear. Columns of infantry descended from the eastern hills, while cavalry regiments surged ahead in waves of steel and shadow. This was no small probing attack. It was a determined drive, aimed at cutting the lifeline that connected the Allied armies to Balaclava. Supplies flowed through that narrow harbour: food, ammunition, winter gear, and without it, the siege would collapse before the frost fully arrived. The defenders knew this. Their plan was simple: strike hard, crush the outlying redoubts, and split the coalition before it tightened its grip on the city. The first impact landed on the Ottoman troops stationed in a line of earthworks that guarded the approach. These soldiers, many recently recovered from earlier campaigns, held their ground with surprising ferocity. Smoke billowed from their rifles as volleys cracked across the valley. For a short while, the attackers reeled under the unexpected resistance, but weight of numbers soon told. Redoubt after redoubt fell, its defenders forced to retreat in small, desperate knots. Dust rose in choking clouds as fleeing units scrambled back toward the heights. From the Allied camps, officers watched the unfolding storm with grim realization. The ridge guarding Balaclava now lay vulnerable. If the attackers broke through, the entire southern army would be cut off from its supplies. Infantry scrambled to assemble. Bugles blared, cavalry mounted up in haste. Yet the attackers had already swept across the plain, seizing captured guns and pushing deeper than expected. A line of scarlet coats soon appeared across the rising ground, a single British regiment drawn up in an impossibly thin formation. Only 2 ranks deep, they formed a long, unwavering strip of red against the green slope. Observers from the Allied heights scarcely believed what they saw. A cavalry wave was charging straight toward them. Dust plumed beneath pounding hooves. Lances glimmered in the cold morning light. The defenders held their breath. Then the line fired. A rolling volley tore into the front of the charge. Horses screamed and tumbled. Riders pitched from their saddles. Yet the regiment did not break. They stood like a narrow wall of steel, reloading with disciplined precision. A second volley followed, shearing momentum from the assault. The remaining riders veered away, unwilling to crash into the deadly firestorm. That stand, though brief, stopped the advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Word spread quickly through the hills. The line had held. But the chaos of battle was far from over. Confusion swirled between the ridges, and amid misinterpreted signals and the fog of war, another cavalry brigade received an order that changed the course of the day. Believing they were to pursue a retreating enemy, they advanced down a long, narrow valley, flanked by batteries on both sides. Officers attempted to verify the order, but the moment passed too quickly. With sabers drawn, they surged forward into a corridor of fire. From the heights, soldiers watched the charge with disbelief. The valley erupted as cannons unleashed volleys into the advancing ranks. Gaps tore open in the tight formation, only for riders behind to fill them instantly. The light brigade pressed on with unwavering speed, ignoring the deadly rain falling around them. By the time they reached the enemy guns at the valley's end, their numbers had thinned drastically. They fought with astonishing courage among the cannon crews, but the weight of defenders soon overwhelmed them. Survivors wheeled their exhausted mounts and galloped back through the same gauntlet of fire. When they returned, the brigade was a shadow of what it had been. Horses collapsed from exhaustion and wounds. Men staggered back to friendly lines, stunned by the carnage they had witnessed. Silence gripped the watching regiments, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery still trading blows across the plain. Balaclava had ended in a grim stalemate, one that preserved the Allied lifeline, but revealed how thinly stretched the entire army had become. No sooner had the echo of that battle faded than another storm gathered on the opposite flank. Early November brought a heavy fog that draped the heights around Inkerman like a shroud. Visibility shrank to mere yards. Even voices seemed swallowed by the thick air. Soldiers on picket duty pressed close to their fires, trying to gauge whether distant shapes were trees or approaching men. Just after sunrise, the fog itself seemed to move. Shapes resolved into columns of infantry advancing silently through the mist. Then came the first musket cracks, brief flashes swallowed instantly by grey. The defenders leapt to arms. Confusion reigned as units struggled to navigate terrain they could hardly see. Officers on horseback became disoriented. Couriers vanished into the fog and never returned. The attackers had chosen their moment well. They surged against the British positions guarding the high ground, attempting to push them off the ridge and collapse the siege lines from behind. At first, the thin screen of outposts buckled. Rifles flashed at close range, their smoke hanging in the air with nowhere to drift. Men stumbled over rocks and tree roots as they fought in near blindness. The battle seemed less like an ordered engagement and more like a series of brutal collisions between small groups who encountered each other by accident. For hours, the defenders held only through determination. Bayonets clashed in chaotic melees that drifted back and forth across the slopes. Officers struggled to direct their men through the haze, relying on shouted orders that vanished into the fog. Before reaching the intended units, regiments fought almost independently, each one carving out its own desperate stand. Yet despite their numbers, the attackers struggled to coordinate. They crashed against the ridge in fragmented waves, unable to exploit the full weight of their formations. As the battle teetered on a knife's edge, a sudden burst of sound rose from the west. Trumpets, drums, and cries carried faintly through the fog. Reinforcements had arrived. French units, marching swiftly from the southern lines, plunged into the fight. Their appearance shocked the attackers, who had not expected them to emerge so quickly in such difficult visibility. The newcomers charged uphill with fierce momentum, their officers leading from the front, shouting encouragement as they swept into the confused melee. This intervention reversed the course of the fight. Momentum shifted as defenders pushed back with renewed strength. The attackers, now losing cohesion, began to withdraw toward their original lines. Mist swallowed them once more, leaving only silence and the moans of the wounded scattered across the ridge. When the fog finally lifted, hours later, the full scale of the struggle emerged. Thousands dead or wounded in a battle that had been fought blindly, almost by instinct. Exhaustion settled heavily over the Allied camps. Balaclava had strained their defenses. Inkerman had nearly broken them, yet they had held. The siege lines remained intact, though at a terrible cost. The hope that the city might be taken before winter now seemed faint. Every general understood that what lay ahead was not a short campaign, but a protracted struggle that would test endurance more than daring. Beyond the battlefield, effects rippled across Europe. News of the fog-shrouded fight reached London and Paris with startling speed. Reports spoke of muddy hills lit by muzzle flashes, of regiments fighting in conditions so thick they could hardly see their own hands. The descriptions captured the imagination of readers who, until now, had pictured war as a distant abstraction. At the same time, the stories of heroism and of catastrophic mistakes stirred anger and admiration in equal measure. For men in the trenches, however, there was little time to dwell on such reports. New orders circulated as soon as the wounded were carried from the field. Winter was approaching. The siege had to continue, no matter how heavy the cost. The defenders had proven their strength. The Allies would now need to match it with their own. And so, amid the churned mud of Inkerman and the shattered ground around Balaclava, both armies braced for the long, bitter season ahead. The city still stood defiant, and the lines tightening around it would soon feel the weight of storms, shortages, and relentless struggle. The ridge above Inkerman had scarcely fallen quiet when winter swept across the heights with merciless force. Winds howled through the trenches, tearing at canvas and carrying icy needles that stung exposed skin. The mud left by autumn rains hardened into uneven ridges that bruised every footstep. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever rags they could find, huddling together at night for warmth as their breath formed pale clouds in the frigid dawn. Many had survived the horrors of battle only to face a new enemy, one that cared nothing for courage or rank. Those stationed nearest the forward lines suffered worst. Their trenches, carved hastily before the storm season, now froze so solid that picks bounced off the walls. Fires were forbidden in many positions for fear of drawing artillery fire, and even where flames were permitted, the thin smoke spiraled instantly into bitter gusts. Water barrels froze, bread turned to stone, rifles jammed unless cleaned constantly, which required bare fingers, numbed to uselessness. More men fell to exposure and illness than to bullets during those first terrible weeks. Behind the lines, Balaclava strained under the pressure of sustaining the entire army. The harbour, once a promising lifeline, now groaned beneath the weight of ships crammed with supplies. Yet bottlenecks emerged everywhere. Roads leading inland were nearly impassable, slick with ice, choked with mud, or blocked by abandoned wagons whose wheels had shattered on the frozen ruts. Horses that had survived long marches now collapsed in harness, ribs visible beneath their dull coats. Drivers cursed the cold, the roads, and the unrelenting demand for food and ammunition. The Allies tried to improvise. Infantrymen hauled sacks of grain on their backs when draft animals could no longer manage the climb. Artillery teams dismantled guns and dragged them piece by piece through the winter sludge. The arrival of even a single crate of boots or blankets lifted spirits briefly, before the men remembered how many more crates were still needed. Every small success felt like a victory stolen from disaster. Even amid the hardship, the siege lines continued to evolve. The defenders inside Sevastopol observed the storms with grim satisfaction, yet they too endured the season's cruelty. Their trenches filled with snow that had to be shoveled away repeatedly. Rations dwindled, medical tents overflowed. Horses died in such numbers that their carcasses lay frozen outside the city walls until work parties dragged them away for burning. When winds shifted, smoke from these pyres drifted into Allied trenches, a choking reminder that the defenders suffered as fiercely as their besiegers. Despite the misery, both armies pressed on. Each night, flares rose into the air as watchmen signaled that movement had been spotted between the lines. Rifle fire followed, echoing through the ravines in sporadic bursts. Men crouched low in the icy dark, clutching their weapons, knowing that any hour might bring a sudden rush of enemy skirmishers. More than once, a drifting snowstorm allowed defenders to creep close enough to lob grenades into unfinished batteries before retreating unseen into the swirling white. But winter did not belong solely to small raids. Deep within the Allied camps, commanders recognized the need to strengthen their tactics and restore momentum before the siege devolved into stagnation. New planning sessions convened in thick-walled tents where lanterns flickered against maps weighed down by stones. Representatives from every contingent attended, British officers with weary eyes, French generals confident in their growing numerical advantage, Ottoman commanders determined to prove their worth, and Sardinian envoys listening carefully, knowing their nation was preparing to join the struggle. The French, spared the worst privations by their better supply systems, stepped forward with renewed vigor. Their battalions had endured the cold, but their organization remained largely intact. As winter gradually eased, they pressed to assume greater responsibility along the southern front. Their engineers carved fresh zigzag trenches in the direction of key outlying positions. Their artillery officers marked potential gun emplacements on hillsides, where they could concentrate fire on the Malakoff and the Mamelon, dominant heights whose capture would define the next phase of the siege. For the British, recovery proved slower. The losses at Balaclava and Inkerman weighed heavily on their dwindling ranks. Yet fresh reinforcements began to arrive with the thaw. Regiments long stationed in distant corners of empire reached the peninsula after arduous voyages, bringing new uniforms, new rifles, and renewed morale. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere. Veterans who had endured the worst of winter felt a surge of strength, knowing new hands would share the burden. Meanwhile, the Sardinians made preparations to join the front in earnest. Their leaders saw the war as an opportunity, an avenue to demonstrate loyalty to France and raise their nation's standing within Europe. Even before their troops arrived, small detachments observed the siege lines, taking note of the rocky slopes, the artillery placements, and the elaborate networks of trenches. When their full force eventually reached the heights, they would be ready. With the coming of spring, the thaw transformed the battlefield once more. Snow melted, turning frozen earth back into mud, though of a different sort, slick and sucking, rather than brittle and sharp. Yet the longer daylight hours allowed greater progress. Engineers extended the siege lines forward by degrees, driving trenches toward the Russian works like fingers reaching for a throat. Each new sally into no man's land prompted fierce resistance. Riflemen crouched behind low rises, firing into the exposed teams laboring with picks and shovels. Many fell where they worked, transformed instantly from builders into casualties. Artillery duels intensified as the weather warmed. Smoke no longer drifted sluggishly across the plain, but rose rapidly into the fresh spring air. Massive guns, hauled with difficulty up the slopes, opened fire in coordinated barrages designed to test the strength of the enemy's southern bastions. Stone cracked. Dust billowed. Yet the defenders fired back just as relentlessly, their own pieces carefully placed to sweep the approaches where Allied guns clustered. Despite these challenges, a shift in momentum gradually became apparent. The Allies' logistical position improved. As fresh supply ships reached Balaclava, without the winter's storms to scatter them, wagons rolled more easily across firmer ground. Medical tents received better equipment. New boots and coats replaced tattered remnants. Though the siege remained grueling, the sense of barely clinging to survival began to fade. By early May, the Allied command believed the time had come to intensify pressure on the outlying defenses. The French took the lead, their troops, seasoned by campaigns in North Africa and fortified by months of preparation, moved forward into advanced trenches closer than ever to the enemy lines. Night after night, they crept outward, hammering stakes, tossing earth, and linking zigzags of new passageways. From above, the siege works looked like a web tightening around the southern heights. The defenders reacted swiftly. Under cover of darkness, they launched sharp counterattacks against these new trenches. Lanterns bobbed in the gloom as shadows surged forward, bayonets glinting. Short, violent clashes erupted at the edge of the works. Some assaults captured small stretches of trench. Others left piles of bodies strewn across the ravines. But each time, the attackers withdrew before dawn, unwilling to commit fully while the main assault remained distant. Spring also brought renewed strain upon the Russian supply routes. Their army depended heavily on convoys traversing vast distances across rough terrain. With the Sea of Azov increasingly threatened by Allied naval activity, these routes became even more tenuous. Reports reached the Allied camps that hunger and sickness inside the city were rising. Yet the defenders held firm, their resolve fueled by a mixture of patriotism, desperation, and the knowledge that surrender would mean disgrace. In response to these tightening conditions, the Allied command called for new batteries to be constructed along ridges that overlooked key outlying strongholds. Guns of extraordinary size were hauled into position, dragged by dozens of horses and entire teams of laborers. Once emplaced, these massive pieces promised to unleash a bombardment unlike anything the defenders had faced thus far. By the final weeks of May, the siege works had transformed the hills into a maze of trenches, redoubts, and artillery lines. Paths wound between gabions filled with stones. Rifle pits dotted the front like beads on a string. Soldiers could traverse long distances without ever exposing themselves to open ground. At the same time, the defenders deepened their own networks, countermining in some areas and establishing new lines further back in case forward positions fell. It was clear to all that the quiet misery of winter had given way to a new phase. The Allies, newly reinforced and better supplied, stood poised to escalate the siege dramatically. Their commanders believed that with coordinated pressure on the outer defenses, the city's heart might eventually be forced open. The long struggle for the heights was about to begin in earnest, and with it, the fate of Sevastopol would inch closer to its moment of reckoning. The first real break in the siege's rhythm came with the renewed focus on the positions that guarded the southern approaches. Among these, two places dominated every conversation along the Allied lines: the Mamelon and the Great Redan. Both rose from the rugged slopes like twin bastions of defiance, their earthen faces bristling with cannon and rifle pits. If the Allies could seize them, the city beyond would lie dangerously exposed. If they failed, the siege would stretch into another grinding season. Work toward these objectives occurred under constant threat. Every foot of new trench carved toward the forward positions drew fire from the defenders. Rifle shots cracked from unseen hideouts. Shells arced from batteries hidden behind the Mamelon's crest. Each day, the earth around the advancing zigzags grew pocked with fresh craters. Yet progress continued, measured not in leaps, but in inches. Where one trench reached its end, another began, twisting through the ravines like a living thing. The French took the forefront of these preparations. Their engineers moved with practiced efficiency, surveying angles and distances, marking the most promising approaches. Every night, after sunset painted the sky a deep blue, they guided teams forward to extend the lines. Earth flew, picks struck stone, and new segments appeared by dawn. Though defenders often disrupted the work with sudden bursts of fire, the momentum could not be reversed. A sense grew within the Allied camps that the French drive toward the Mamelon might finally open the path long sought since winter's retreat. Meanwhile, the defenders strengthened the heights with equal determination. New parapets rose, fresh embrasures appeared where none had existed the day before. Entire batteries materialized seemingly overnight, each one aimed at trenches creeping steadily forward. Small detachments patrolled the slopes relentlessly, ready to challenge any workers who ventured too far. Whenever the Allied guns attempted to quiet these positions, the city's engineers simply adapted, shifting weapons or digging fresh pits. As May bled into June, the first major assault came. Allied commanders agreed that striking the Mamelon would force the defenders to divert reinforcements from the city's interior. When the signal guns sounded, French infantry surged from the forward trenches, charging uphill through dust and smoke. Their blue coats flashed between bursts of musket fire as they advanced in waves, climbing toward the sharp ridge crowned by the enemy's redoubt. The fight was brutal. The slope offered little cover. The defenders' guns swept the ground with terrible efficiency. Yet the French pressed on, drums beat behind them, their steady rhythm lost amid the roar of battle. Officers shouted orders that vanished beneath the thunder of artillery. Even as some units faltered, others pushed past them, seizing a foothold near the crest. Bayonets flashed. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the ditch. For a moment, it seemed the attackers might break through entirely. In the end, they succeeded, but at heavy cost. The defenders withdrew to secondary lines, firing as they retreated, and the Mamelon fell into Allied hands. Cheers rose from the trenches below, though the celebration was brief. Everyone understood what this foothold meant. A step forward, not a victory. The city still loomed behind thick walls, its other strong points connected by a network of defenses left untouched. The Mamelon had been a gatekeeper. Now the real struggle lay ahead. Seizing that ridge emboldened the Allies. French officers planned their next move with mounting confidence, believing that pressure on the remaining southern forts would erode the defenders' will. British regiments prepared to join the coming assaults, their men studying the ridgelines that led toward the Great Redan. Though memories of earlier setbacks lingered, especially the horrors of Inkerman, the troops now felt renewed purpose. Their new trenches lay closer to the city than ever before, but events beyond the battlefield soon cast a shadow across the campaign. Word spread quietly at first, whispered through the mess tents and laundering lines. The Emperor in St. Petersburg had died. How exactly the news reached the front remained unclear. Yet steel-hard certainty settled in. Nicholas I, who had driven the war from its beginning, was gone. His successor, younger and less rigid, now guided the empire's fate. The impact rippled through both camps. Among the defenders, grief mingled with uncertainty. Some believed the change could bring new resources to the front. Others feared it signaled diminishing resolve. In the Allied lines, officers speculated whether the shift in leadership might hasten negotiations or provoke fresh aggression. Yet on the slopes before the city, little changed. The cannons fired, the trenches deepened, the siege continued. As June advanced, the Allies resolved to widen the pressure. Fresh batteries arrived near the front, massive weapons capable of hurling shells with unprecedented force. Teams of horses strained to drag them through the churned earth, their hooves slipping as drivers urged them up the ridge. Once emplaced, engineers anchored them with layers of timber and earth. When these guns finally opened fire, their roar rolled across the plain in long, echoing waves. Entire embrasures collapsed under their bombardment, and sections of the defenders' parapets crumbled into dust. This intensifying bombardment reached its peak on the 18th of June. The day dawned hot, the air thick with powder smoke that drifted lazily between the lines. French and British commanders had chosen this date deliberately. It marked the anniversary of a battle etched deeply into their shared memory, a moment of triumph in earlier generations. Now they hoped to echo that legacy by delivering a decisive blow. The plan called for the French to attack the Malakoff first, drawing attention and fire, while the British stormed the Great Redan once the defenders shifted their weight. Before sunrise, troops gathered in the trenches, adjusting straps and checking rifles. Silence hung heavy. Then, at the signal, the French surged forward. Their columns raced uphill, weaving between craters and shattered gabions. But as they neared the slope's crest, a shocking reality became clear. The defenders had known of the plan. Instead of being caught off guard, the southern bastions erupted with coordinated fire. Shells burst among the attackers. Grapeshot tore through ranks, lines bunched and spread, reforming only to collapse again under the relentless barrage. Still the French pressed on. Some reached the ditch, climbing over their fallen comrades. Others stood fast under murderous fire, determined to break through no matter the cost. By mid-morning, however, it was evident the assault had failed. Units withdrew reluctantly, dragging wounded men with them through the smoking ravines. Across the line, the British attempted their own advance. Their route toward the Redan proved even more punishing. The moment they left the cover of their trenches, a maelstrom of fire enveloped them. Men fell in clusters. Officers waved their swords, urging their companies forward through the chaos, only to be cut down themselves. The survivors stumbled back into their trenches, dazed and furious, unable to breach the immense defenses looming above them. The losses on both sides were staggering. When the smoke cleared, stretcher-bearers moved across ground, littered with torn uniforms, broken rifles, and the fallen. The attack that had been meant to deliver a decisive break had instead left the Allied lines reeling. Confidence wavered. Some feared the defenders would seize the initiative and launch their own counterattack. Yet the defenders had paid dearly as well. Their own trenches overflowed with casualties, and ammunition stores dwindled faster than they could be replenished. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair the damage inflicted by the bombardment, while officers struggled to keep exhausted units engaged. With each passing week, the strain inside the city grew heavier. In the broader campaign, strain spread beyond Crimea. Further east, along the shores of the Sea of Azov, Allied naval forces intensified their operations. attacking depots and severing crucial supply routes. The hammering of cannon along those distant waters added new pressure on the embattled defenders, who now faced dwindling options for food and ammunition. Each report from that front added urgency to the decisions made atop the heights around Sevastopol. By late June, one conclusion settled across the Allied command. Despite the heavy losses, the siege could not be abandoned. The positions gained, the Mamelon, the forward trenches, the new batteries, had to be held and exploited. Fresh assaults would be planned, though wiser heads now urged patience. The city might not fall in a single blaze of courage. Instead, it would require relentless grinding pressure. Among the soldiers in the trenches, the mood shifted from frustration to grim determination. They had endured winter. They had survived storm and starvation. They had watched friends fall during failed assaults and still held their positions. The thought of turning back now felt unthinkable. So the spades returned to work, carving new lines toward the fortress. Artillery crews repaired their guns. Reinforcements filtered in, and across the ravines, the defenders watched warily, understanding that the next blow would come. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this week, but soon. The siege, once bogged in winter's misery, had entered a new phase. The pressure around the heights tightened, and every man on the peninsula sensed the moment approaching, when the walls of Sevastopol would face their greatest test yet. The sun climbed higher over the Crimean hills, casting long shadows across the maze of trenches that now strangled the approaches to Sevastopol. Dust rose with every step, settling on uniforms, rifles, and the weary faces of men who had spent months clawing their way closer to the stronghold. The failed assaults of June lingered in memory, but they did not halt the work. Every sunrise brought renewed activity. Timber carried to reinforce parapets, shells stacked beside guns, pickaxes biting into stubborn soil as crews extended the siege lines one deliberate stroke at a time. In the distance, the Malakoff towered like a stone sentinel. Its walls, once daunting but simple, had grown into a layered fortress. Gabions, beams, and packed earth buttressed every angle. Fresh trenches curled outward like reaching arms. To the men watching from Allied lines, it looked less like a building and more like a living creature, a hardened thing that learned from each bombardment and reshaped itself overnight. Around it, smaller forts bristled with cannon mouths scanning the ravines below. Throughout July, preparations intensified. French engineers paced the forward batteries with measuring sticks and notebooks, studying the distance to the Malakoff's outer ditch. They traced routes where their columns might advance under fire. They examined the effects of earlier bombardments, noting weaknesses in the enemy's embrasures. Nearby, British gunners adjusted their trajectories meticulously, coordinating with their French counterparts so that the next great barrage would fall with devastating symmetry rather than scattered force. All the while, the defenders, exhausted, hungry, yet resolute, watched the enemy's determination grow. Their own engineers rarely slept. They worked beside soldiers, dragging timber, packing earth, repairing damage inflicted by nightly shelling. Even after months of siege, the fortress had not fallen, and every day it remained standing felt like a victory. But the strain was visible. Powder stores dwindled. Ammunition wagons struggled to reach the front through routes increasingly targeted by naval attacks along the Sea of Azov, and sickness crept through the ranks, thinning the numbers of those who could lift a shovel or a rifle. In early August, a new urgency seized the Allied command. Reports revealed that the defenders' last significant supply lines were faltering. Rumors whispered that morale inside the city hung by threads. Seizing the moment, the generals resolved to unleash a bombardment. unmatched by anything yet witnessed on the peninsula. Their goal was clear: shatter the malleable outer defenses, cripple the artillery, and pave the way for an assault that would not rely on surprise, but on sheer, overwhelming force. When the bombardment began, the entire horizon seemed to ignite. The thunder of guns rolled across the ravines like the roar of a storm breaking over cliffs. Shells soared overhead in endless arcs, their trails carving pale streaks through the smoky sky. Each impact sent shudders through the earth. Stones flew in every direction. Timber splintered. Clouds of dust swallowed whole segments of the Malakoff's face. The defenders replied as best they could, but their shots came less frequently now, and often from positions partially buried under debris. The barrage did not ease at night. Red flashes lit the darkness as if the sun had merely slipped below the horizon to prepare for another onslaught. Men in the Allied trenches watched the bombardment with grim fascination. Some murmured that the ground shook like the deck of a ship in rough seas. Others counted the seconds between blasts, trying to ignore the fear that the next shell might fall short. But beneath their apprehension lay resolve. They had endured a year of storms, battles, and trench sickness. They would finish what they had begun. The defenders endured the pounding with grim endurance. Some crouched in tunnels, dug beneath the forts, waiting for orders and praying the walls above would hold. Others rushed from position to position, extinguishing fires or helping wounded comrades who had been buried by collapsing parapets. The constant roar deafened them, dust coated their lungs, yet they refused to abandon their posts. Every moment they held the line delayed the assault they knew must come. At last, one morning, the guns fell silent. The sudden quiet felt unsettling, as if the world had paused mid-breath. Dust still drifted through the air, glowing faintly in the early light. Across the siege lines, soldiers lifted their heads, listening. The silence held. Then officers moved through the trenches, delivering the long-awaited command. The assault would begin. On the French side, battalions formed in tight ranks behind the forward works. The men wiped sweat from their faces and adjusted straps on their packs. Flags fluttered in the faint breeze. Couriers galloped between units carrying last-minute instructions. Each company knew its exact role: who would lead the charge, who would scale the ditch, who would follow with grenades and axes. Months of preparation had been distilled into a plan that demanded perfect timing and extraordinary courage. Across the lines, British units readied themselves as well, though their task differed. Their assault on the Great Redan would begin once the French struck the Malakoff officers, reviewed maps under the shade of battered gabions, pointing out the shortest routes across open ground. Soldiers checked bayonets, whispered to one another, and tried to steady their nerves. They knew the ground before the Redan offered little protection. They would need to reach the parapet in a single rush or face terrible losses. When the signal came, it was a sharp, unmistakable sound. One of the forward batteries firing a single shot skyward. French officers raised their swords. The first waves surged from their trenches, running into the drifting haze. Drums beat a steady cadence behind them. The men advanced not in scattered leaps, but in controlled momentum, like a tide rolling uphill. Smoke swirled around their legs as they moved toward the jagged remains of earthworks battered by the week-long bombardment. The defenders responded instantly. Muskets flashed from hidden crevices. Cannon thundered from partially buried batteries. Yet the French pressed forward, driven by months of hardship and the knowledge that the entire campaign hinged upon this moment. They reached the ditch, scrambled across debris, and slammed into the outer slope of the Malakoff. Grenades burst overhead. Shouts echoed through the dust. For a few heartbeats, a chaotic swirl of bodies obscured the fort's crest. Then the French flag appeared atop the parapet. A roar erupted from the Allied lines. The breakthrough had come. After a year of bloodshed, the key to the southern defense was finally in their hands. But the triumph unfolded in a maelstrom. Fighting raged inside the Malakoff's ruined interior as defenders launched counterattacks again and again, determined to retake the position. The French held firm, their lines bending but never breaking. Every minute they occupied the fort tightened the noose around the city. On the British flank, the signal to advance arrived moments after the French stormed the Malakoff. Their task was grimmer. The Redan stood intact, untouched by recent breakdowns, its guns repaired, its riflemen positioned with deadly clarity, yet orders were absolute. The British surged across the ravine, bayonets glinting as they climbed the exposed slope. A hail of fire tore through their ranks. Whole sections fell before reaching the ditch. Officers tried to rally survivors toward the parapet, but the storm of shot and shell was overwhelming. Still they pressed on, one wave after another, determination outweighing hope. Some reached the ditch and scrambled upward, only to be driven back by defenders firing downward at point-blank range. The ground behind them turned into a tangle of wounded men calling for help. Surgeons stationed behind the lines worked feverishly, bandaging and amputating, with hands slick from sweat and blood. By midday, the outcome was evident. The French had taken the Malakoff, and they held it. The British attack on the Redan had failed, but it no longer mattered in the same way. Without the Malakoff, the city's entire southern defense became untenable. The defenders, recognizing the gravity of the loss, began preparing for a retreat across the harbor. Fires rose from storage sheds as supplies were destroyed. Wagons clattered through narrow streets, carrying the wounded toward the northern shore. On the heights, the Allies watched smoke billow upward, while exhausted French soldiers secured the position they had paid for with terrible sacrifice. Those who stood on the Malakoff's walls saw the city stretched beneath them, ruined, burning, but still defiant. They understood that the assault had shifted the balance irreversibly. The southern face of Sevastopol had been pierced, and with that breach, the city's fate was sealed. Smoke from burning storehouses drifted over the southern bastions, a bitter haze that clung to every trench and ravine. The Malakoff, now firmly held by French infantry, loomed over the shattered outskirts like a crown of broken stone. Its capture had struck at the heart of the city's defense, and all who watched understood the implications. The defenders could not hold their southern quarter any longer. The order to retreat would come, if it had not been whispered already through corridors and barracks lit by flickering lanterns. Inside the ruined streets, the realization spread swiftly. Officers hurried through alleys, shouting instructions, their voices competing with crackling flames and distant gunfire. Civilians stumbled from cellars, clutching bundles of possessions or leading terrified children by the hand. Soldiers guided them toward the northern shore, urging haste before the southern districts collapsed entirely. Dust and ash swirled through the air, dimming the midday sun and casting the city in a sickly orange glow. The withdrawal itself began in frantic waves. Engineers rushed to secure the bridges spanning the harbor, pounding wooden planks into place so that retreating units could cross wagons loaded with cannon barrels and crates of ammunition rattled over the makeshift structures, their wheels clattering loudly as they approached the northern shore. Midway through the crossing, some vehicles veered dangerously close to the edge where shattered boards threatened to give way. Drivers cracked their reins and urged the horses forward. knowing that hesitation might mean tumbling into the water below. Amid the chaos, infantry formations fell back in disciplined ranks, shielding the retreat from Allied sharpshooters positioned on the newly captured heights. Officers barked orders to keep the pace steady. Messengers sprinted between companies, delivering urgent notes to commanders stationed along the waterfront. The retreat had to remain orderly. If panic broke out, the bridge could choke with fleeing soldiers and civilians, trapping thousands on the doomed southern shore. Throughout these movements, the remaining defenders continued their grim task of ensuring nothing useful fell into enemy hands. Forges were doused, arsenals dismantled, and supplies thrown into the harbor. Flames spread across warehouses filled with timber and stores, each fire feeding the sky with columns of black smoke. Explosions rippled across the district as powder magazines ignited, sending shockwaves through the streets. Shattered windows rained shards of glass upon cobblestones already slick with soot. Those explosions rattled the Allied trenches as well. Gunners paused, unsure whether the blasts signaled a counterattack or the destruction of the city's own defenses. The air trembled with each detonation. Then came the sight of figures fleeing through the smoke, carrying what few possessions they had salvaged from the Malakoff's vantage point. French officers watched the exodus and understood that the defenders were abandoning the southern half of the city entirely. Their withdrawal accelerated as shadows lengthened. Nurses from field hospitals guided the wounded toward the crossing. Some carried on stretchers, others supported between two comrades. One young woman called out for help when her patients nearly toppled from a cart that jostled violently on uneven stones. Volunteers rushed forward, lifting the injured with careful urgency. Behind them, the flames crept closer, crackling against wooden beams and hurling sparks through shattered doorways. In one quarter near the waterfront, a group of soldiers lingered at a burning barracks. They heaved barrels of gunpowder into the flames, stepping back as each one flared and burst. One man flinched at a sudden crack overhead. A roof beam had collapsed, sending embers swirling. Yet he stayed until his superior urged him onward. The work was essential. The enemy could not be allowed to use anything that remained. By dusk, the retreat had grown desperate. Smoke thickened, obscuring the path to the bridge. Families clung together as they approached the crossing, some coughing violently from inhaling the fumes. Soldiers lifted children onto wagons or carried them in their arms, navigating through crowds of exhausted civilians and stragglers. The cries of the wounded merged with shouts from officers directing traffic. The city, once vibrant with shipyards and markets, now resembled a yawning furnace. On the Allied side, the scene unfolded with a mix of triumph and grim caution. Troops advanced cautiously through the outskirts, stepping over rubble still warm from recent bombardment. Fires lit the ruins in shifting reds and golds, revealing shattered walls and collapsed roofs. Though eager to push deeper, officers held their men back. They knew the defenders had prepared traps, powder charges hidden beneath debris, wires stretched across walkways waiting to be pulled taut. Patience mattered more than speed now. When French units finally entered the southern district, they encountered the aftermath of the retreat. Streets lay strewn with overturned carts, abandoned supplies, and the bodies of those too wounded or exhausted to flee. Windows gaped like hollow eyes in buildings scorched by fire. Occasionally, a lone figure staggered through the smoke, dazed and unaware of the approaching soldiers. These stragglers were taken into custody with quiet efficiency. Farther inland, British units reached positions from which they could observe the harbour. Through the rolling smoke, they saw the last columns of defenders crossing the bridge. officers dispatched artillery to fire warning shots into the air, not aimed at the retreating forces, but to discourage any thought of resistance that might cause further bloodshed. The defenders understood. They continued their march in somber silence, intent only on reaching the relative safety of the northern shore. The final phase of the retreat unfolded under a sky streaked with crimson. Engineers stood poised at the northern side of the bridge, waiting for confirmation that the last groups had crossed. When the word came, they ignited the charges placed beneath its supports. A moment of stillness followed. Then the structure shuddered. Wooden beams splintered. Flames burst upward as the bridge collapsed in sections, sinking into the dark water below. One of the defenders' most vital connections between the two halves of Sevastopol vanished in a plume of fire and spray. With the collapse, the southern city lay abandoned. The defenders gathered along the northern heights, staring across the harbor at the smoldering ruins they had fled. Some wiped soot from their faces. Others removed caps and bowed their heads. They had not surrendered, but they had yielded ground once believed invincible. Their capital in Crimea was now split, its outer shell broken. On the Allied side, troops advanced cautiously toward the waterfront, stepping past embers and shattered masonry. They reached the charred remains of the bridge and gazed across at the silhouettes of soldiers still massed on the opposite bank. Neither side fired. A strange quiet settled over the water, broken only by the hiss of cooling stone and the creak of collapsing timbers. The southern capture did not end the war. Not yet. The defenders still held the northern heights, and the Allies knew the struggle would continue. Yet the strategic blow was unmistakable. The siege had been fought ridge by ridge, battery by battery, trench by trench. Now, the southern half of Sevastopol belonged to the attackers. Behind the northern lines, officers of the retreating army gathered in a half-ruined building to assess their losses. Maps lay spread across a table, beneath a flickering lantern. Every man in the room understood what the fall of the Malakoff meant. They had lost the hinge upon which their defensive arc depended. Continuing to hold the southern city had become impossible. Now they had to preserve what remained of their forces and prepare for the next stage of the fight, whatever shape it might take. The tide had turned, not fully, but unmistakably. As night settled over the broken peninsula, flames still rose from the southern ruins, their glow casting tremulous reflections across the harbor. The Allies held the ground they had sought for so many months. The defenders regrouped beyond the water, clinging to the last strongholds that remained. And so ended the southern defense of Sevastopol, its fall marked not by a single moment, but by a night-long procession of fire, smoke, retreat, and the stubborn will to fight another day. Night settled over the wrecked southern quarter, like a veil drawn across a wound. Fires smoldered among the collapsed warehouses and shattered homes, casting faint, restless glows across the harbor. On the northern shore, the defenders watched the ruins in silence, knowing the city they had once guarded was now divided in two, one half firmly in enemy hands, the other poised on the brink. Yet even in defeat, orders continued, batteries shifted, and sentries stood at attention. The battle for Crimea had not ended, only changed shape. Dawn revealed the stark contrast between the shores. To the south, Allied banners fluttered atop captured bastions. Soldiers combed through the rubble, mapping every usable trench and clearing debris from the approaches engineers discussed, where to position new batteries should the defenders attempt to reclaim ground. Surgeons tended to the wounded, gathered by the water's edge, many of whom had held the Malakoff or attempted to storm the Redan. The cost of the assault was evident everywhere. Across the harbour, the city's northern defences braced for the next storm. Fresh trenches appeared in the early light, gouged into the rocky slopes by men who had marched through the night after abandoning the South. Officers arranged their regiments along the heights, repositioning cannon to cover the narrow approaches that led upward from the docks. Though their numbers had thinned and supplies were scarce, the defenders refused to yield the remainder of the city without resistance. Yet beneath that determination lay deep exhaustion. Powder stocks dwindled with each passing day. Food reached the lines irregularly. Many soldiers stood watch wrapped in torn coats, their breath clouding in the cool September air. The ground beneath their boots, once firm and fortified, now felt transient and vulnerable. Even so, they dug in, unwilling to surrender while a single stronghold remained. In the Allied camps, officers gathered around a long table, set inside a captured building that still stood despite bearing scorch marks along its beams. Maps were spread across the surface, marked with inked lines that traced the ravines, slopes, and defensive arcs of the northern city. Outside, the muffled sounds of work drifted in, shovels striking earth, ropes creaking under loads, artillery wheels grinding across broken stone. Discussions circled the same question: press the attack immediately, while the defenders reeled or paused to reorganize before forcing a final confrontation. The fall of the Malakoff had opened the city's flank, but the northern heights remained formidable. Storming them would demand another sacrifice, one the exhausted regiments might not endure. Some argued that the defenders, strained by retreat and hunger, might abandon the city entirely if pressured steadily through lesser engagements. Others insisted that only a concentrated effort would finish the conflict. While generals debated, news from beyond Crimea shaped their judgments. Reports arrived from the Caucasus. Kars, long besieged by Russian forces, had fallen. That victory allowed the defenders' empire to claim one last bargaining chip in the negotiations everyone sensed approaching. At the same time, the Sea of Azov operations had crippled the flow of grain and ammunition to Sevastopol, tightening the noose around the garrison. Far to the north, the Baltic fleet of the Allies prepared for another season of potential strikes. These developments weighed heavily on commanders who understood that the war had expanded far beyond the trenches surrounding the harbour. As September unfolded, the pattern of life on the peninsula shifted. Fewer sorties erupted from the northern lines. Fewer shells arced across the harbour. Both sides seemed to brace more for winter than for another major assault. The defenders repaired fortifications at a frantic pace, yet their leaders knew the city's fall was only a matter of time. Every day brought fresh reports of hunger and disease. Desertions increased, especially among irregular units brought in from distant provinces. Officers grew harsher in discipline, but discipline alone could not alter reality. Meanwhile, in the Allied camps, something softened. Soldiers who had once braced for battle now spent long moments watching the opposite shore, as if peering across a gulf not only of water, but of exhaustion shared by both camps. The weary faces seen through telescopes looked much like their own, hungry, hollow-eyed, and worn by months of unending strain. Between the two sides stretched not hatred, but the long, heavy fatigue of a conflict that had outlived the ambitions that started it. Beyond the siege lines, diplomatic currents flowed swiftly. Envoys met in European capitals, carrying messages between governments that had grown weary of the toll. Letters were exchanged with increasing frequency, some proposing terms outright, others hinting at concessions that might be accepted if the right assurances were offered. The new emperor in St. Petersburg, aware of the growing desperation in Sevastopol, signaled a willingness to discuss peace, provided his realm did not emerge humiliated. Those signals traveled quickly. In Paris, ministers debated the terms that would satisfy French honor after securing the great fortress. In London, parliamentarians weighed victory against the spiraling cost. Even in Vienna, where caution had marked every decision since the war began, diplomats began to shape frameworks for a settlement. The Ottomans, having seen their lands threatened by invasion and then defended by allies, insisted that their sovereignty be protected in any agreement. Each power guarded its interests as carefully as generals had guarded their lines. On the ground, however, no truce existed yet. Both armies maintained their positions, wary that negotiations might falter at any moment. Patrols still slipped through ravines. At night, artillery fired occasional shots across the harbour. The defenders kept torches burning along the northern walls to signal readiness. The Allies continued to prepare ladders, gabions, and fresh stores of ammunition, unwilling to risk being caught unprepared. Yet even amid vigilance, something in the air had shifted. Soldiers on both sides sensed that the war's temperature was cooling. Skirmishes grew rarer. Gunfire no longer crackled with the same intensity. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when the ravines fell utterly still, broken only by the wind sweeping across the burnt-out ruins of the southern city. Then, one evening, a peculiar quiet settled over the heights. Lamps flickered along both sets of trenches, but few shots were exchanged. The defenders appeared to be moving supplies, rather than preparing for an attack. On the Allied side, officers registered the silence with suspicion. Scouts returned with reports of activity near the northern harbour. Carts had been seen and wagons loaded with crates, but the nature of the movement remained unclear. By morning, it became evident. Preparations for full evacuation were underway. The defenders, though unwilling to formally surrender, had accepted that they could not hold the peninsula. Their remaining artillery was being withdrawn. Their wounded were being carried to ships anchored in the northern bay. Supplies were sorted, those useful taken, those too heavy destroyed. Stand after stand of cannon fell silent as the garrison prepared to abandon the last positions. When the Allied lines advanced cautiously, they found empty trenches and abandoned batteries. Smoke rose from fires lit to consume documents and equipment left behind. A few hopeless pockets of resistance crumbled quickly, overwhelmed by the realization that the fight had moved beyond them. From the northern shore, the final ship set sail under grey skies. Soldiers crowded the decks, gazing back at the shattered city, its southern half blackened by fire, its northern half riddled with trenches and shell craters. Officers kept their men facing outward, forbidding any gesture that might imply surrender. They had not been beaten in pitched battle on these last heights. They simply could not continue. Only when the last vessel slipped beyond the harbour's mouth did the Allies claim the whole city. The siege was over, not with triumphant shouts or a final dramatic assault, but with the slow, grinding exhaustion of a war that drained both victor and vanquished. In the months that followed, diplomacy replaced cannon fire. Representatives met in Paris beneath chandeliers instead of storm clouds. They haggled over borders, guarantees, and the limits placed upon fleets in the Black Sea. Some demands were softened, others accepted with reluctance. When the treaty finally emerged, it restored Ottoman lands, limited Russian naval power, and affirmed collective oversight of the region's Christian subjects. None claimed absolute victory, Yet each nation found something within the document to justify the sacrifices it had endured. As for the soldiers who had fought among the ravines and frozen trenches, their war faded into memory only slowly. Some returned to quiet villages and farms, haunted by echoes of bombardments and the faces of comrades lost along the heights. Others carried medals and scars, visible and hidden. Many never returned at all, buried beneath the same earth they had fought to defend or seize. On the peninsula itself, the ruins of Sevastopol remained as testament. Burned timbers, shattered stone, and empty docks told the story silently to those who walked its streets in the years after wind swept through the gaps where homes once stood. Grass grew along the edges of collapsed bastions, but beneath the silence lay the memory of a struggle that had tested empires, reshaped alliances, and pushed armies to the limits of human endurance. The war had begun with rivalries and ambitions. It ended with negotiations forged from exhaustion, and long after the guns fell silent, the echoes of that siege lingered across the Black Sea.